laying pipe through ground that turned out not to be solid, and in each case the same sequence followed. Something was found. It was noted. It was measured sometimes, photographed occasionally, reported in most cases. And then the questions stopped. Not because the questions were answered, because answering them would have required a different kind of effort than the one anyone was prepared to make at the time. The chambers are still there. Some of them, at least. The ones that haven't been filled in for safety, or absorbed into basements and forgotten, or lost when the surrounding landscape was altered enough that the original survey coordinates no longer match what's on the ground. Scotland has a documented record of underground chambers that do not fit neatly into the accepted story of who was here and what they were capable of. The chambers are real. The debate is about what they mean. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The first thing to understand about Scottish underground chambers is that there are several distinct categories, and they do not all belong to the same conversation. Some of them are well understood. Iron Age souterrains, for instance, which are semi-subterranean stone-lined passages attached to settlement sites, are found all across Scotland and have been excavated and studied with reasonable confidence. They were storage structures, probably for food, probably dug and lined by the same communities whose roundhouses sat directly above them. Archaeologists are comfortable with souterrains. They fit the existing framework. They confirm what the existing framework expects, which is that Iron Age communities in Scotland were capable of organised labour and practical underground construction, but within limits that the framework itself defines. The souterrains are not the mystery. The mystery lives in what keeps turning up that doesn't match the souterrains, the chambers that are too large, the passages that lead nowhere a storage function would require, the chambers cut into bedrock in locations that have no associated settlement evidence above them, the ones sealed in ways that suggest the sealing was intentional and deliberate rather than the result of collapse or soil accumulation, the ones where the stonework is of a quality and precision that the standard model of the period and location cannot fully account for. These are not hypothetical. They are in the records. They have addresses, or had them before the addresses became inconvenient. Scotland's bedrock is some of the oldest in the world. The geology of the Scottish Highlands is Precambrian in significant portions, meaning it predates complex animal life entirely. Lewisian gneiss, found predominantly in the northwest, is among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the planet, in the range of 3 billion years. The geology matters to this story because underground spaces in ancient rock behave differently than underground spaces in younger, softer substrates. Old hard rock does not collapse on the same timescale as limestone karst or sedimentary fills. A chamber cut into Lewisian gneiss or Torridonian sandstone or Old Red Sandstone does not require constant maintenance to remain intact. It persists. It can persist for extraordinarily long periods without visible surface evidence of its existence. This is one of the reasons that discoveries in Scotland keep surprising people. The ground is old enough and hard enough to preserve things that softer ground would long since have swallowed. When a chamber is found beneath a Scottish hillside that does not appear in any record, the absence of a record is not automatically evidence that the chamber is recent. In Scottish geology, absence of record and absence of age are two completely different things. The documented record of anomalous chambers begins, in the modern sense, in the early 19th century, when agricultural improvement projects across the lowlands and the margins of the highlands began systematically altering land that had been farmed in traditional patterns for generations. Drainage was the primary driver. Scottish lowland agriculture had always been constrained by waterlogging, and the improvement movement that swept through from approximately 1760 onward involved the ventilation of drainage networks on a scale that required excavation across hundreds of thousands of acres. It was during these drainage campaigns that the first anomalous chambers began surfacing in records that survive. Not all of them were reported formally. Many were noted only in estate accounts, in the margins of surveyors' notebooks, or in correspondence between landowners and their factors. But enough made it into more formal channels that a pattern emerges when you go looking. The pattern is consistent across region and decade. A work crew excavating a drainage cut breaks through into a void. The void is investigated to some depth, usually with a lamp, sometimes with a rope. Dimensions are noted or estimated. The material of the walls and ceiling is described, natural rock face, or worked stone, or sometimes a combination where the original rock has been shaped and lined selectively. The floor is described, earthen, or stone-flagged, or bare rock. Whether there is any contents is noted, sometimes pottery fragments, sometimes nothing, sometimes evidence of burning in a confined area consistent with a hearth or a lamp platform. And then the report stops. The chamber is either sealed for safety or simply left and avoided, and the drainage project continues around it. Follow-up investigation, in the organized sense of someone returning with the intention of systematic examination, is rare. In the 19th century, it was almost non-existent. In the 20th century, it happened occasionally, usually prompted by a local antiquarian or a university researcher who had encountered the original report and wanted to see what was there. By the time these follow-up visits occurred, conditions had often changed. Ground had shifted, water had entered, the opening had been deliberately sealed by a later landowner for liability reasons. In several documented cases, the chamber had been partially destroyed by subsequent work that the original report had failed to prevent because the report itself had not been routed to anyone with the authority to protect the site. The geography of Scotland's anomalous chamber reports clusters in several zones. The first and most densely documented is Angus and Perthshire, the lowland and foothill country northeast of the Highland Line. This is souterrain country in the conventional sense, which is both why the anomalous reports from here are relatively numerous and why many of them have been absorbed into the souterrain category without scrutiny. When your framework tells you that underground chambers in Angus are souterrains, it becomes easy to label everything underground in Angus as a souterrain and move on. But some of the chambers reported from Angus in the 19th and early 20th centuries are described in terms that do not match souterrain dimensions or construction. Souterrains are typically low, rarely exceeding 1.5 meters in height at their interior peak, and are associated with specific above-ground settlement patterns that leave recognizable archaeological signatures. Some of the Angus chambers are described as standing height. Some are described in isolation, with no associated surface archaeology. Some have passages extending beyond the main chamber in directions that a storage function does not require. These are in the written record. They are not extrapolated or inferred. They were written down by people who were there. The second zone is the Orkney archipelago, which is exceptional in Scottish prehistory generally and is exceptional in the underground chamber question specifically. Orkney is already known for its extraordinary concentration of Neolithic surface architecture. Skara Brae is the famous example, a settlement of stone-built houses predating Stonehenge, preserved by the same sand accumulation that hid it for millennia before a storm exposed it in 1850. Maeshowe is a chambered cairn of exceptional precision, aligned to the midwinter solstice with an accuracy that was not accidental and was not simple. The ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stennis predate Stonehenge by centuries. Orkney's surface Neolithic record is extraordinary. What is less discussed is the degree to which the underground record of Orkney remains incompletely mapped. Geophysical surveys conducted in the last 2 decades have identified void signatures beneath and adjacent to known sites that have not been excavated. The reasoning for not excavating is not lack of interest. It is resource limitation, preservation concerns, and the complexity of navigating multiple interests, including landowners, heritage bodies, and Orcadian communities themselves. The voids are real. They are in the survey data. What they contain is unknown. The third zone is the Western Isles, particularly Lewis and Harris, and the Uists. The Outer Hebrides sit on some of the oldest geology in Europe and have been continuously inhabited for at least 6,000 years at known sites, and almost certainly longer at sites not yet identified. The Western Isles have a documented history of underground chamber discoveries that goes back at least to the early 19th century, and probably considerably further in the oral record of the communities that lived there. The islanders knew about underground spaces in their landscape, in the way that people who have lived in a place for many generations know things that outsiders have to discover through excavation. Some of these spaces were used within recorded history for shelter, storage, and concealment during periods of conflict. But some of the descriptions in the older accounts suggest spaces that predate any historically documented use and that have architectural features inconsistent with any known period of construction on the islands. Let's talk about what the chambers actually look like, in the cases where they were described carefully enough to draw conclusions. The chambers that raise the most persistent questions share several characteristics. They are cut into bedrock or are stone-lined against bedrock, meaning they are not simply earthen-walled pits. The stonework, where present, uses dry stone construction but at a quality that required selection and fitting of stones rather than the opportunistic stacking of available material. The interiors are dry in the sense that water does not pool in them in the way it would in a simple void in water table contact. They are either above the water table by design or they incorporate drainage features that keep them dry. The floors are level. Not approximately level in the way that an unmodified natural void might happen to be approximately level, but deliberately leveled, sometimes with a flagged surface. The entry points are narrow relative to the interior volume, a configuration that would make no sense for a structure whose primary purpose was ease of access. And many of them have what the records describe as a sealed or blocked condition at the time of discovery, meaning the original entry had been deliberately closed rather than simply collapsing or accumulating fill naturally. That last feature, the deliberate sealing, is the one that generates the most sustained debate among the researchers who take these sites seriously. Natural voids do not seal themselves. Structural collapse can create an effective seal, but collapse sealing looks different from intentional sealing. When the blocking material at a chamber entrance is carefully placed, consists of fitted stone or specific fill material rather than random debris, and is positioned in a way that required deliberate effort, the conclusion that someone chose to close that entrance is not unreasonable. The question is why. There are several possible answers, none of which is universally satisfying. The space was no longer needed, and the inhabitants sealed it as a matter of practice. The space contained something that was intended to be preserved and protected. The space was sealed against a threat, whether environmental or human. The sealing was a ritual act associated with the end of a site's functional use. Combinations of these, all of them remain possible because the evidence in most cases is insufficient to choose between them. There is a specific class of sealed underground chamber in Scotland that the academic literature has engaged with reluctantly, and the popular literature has engaged with enthusiastically and inaccurately, which is a combination that tends to produce more heat than light. These are the chambers where the sealing appears to postdate the last occupation, where there is evidence of intentional placement of objects within the chamber before sealing, and where the objects in question represent something more than mundane storage. In a small number of well-documented cases, chambers were found to contain arrangements of objects, grouped, positioned deliberately, that do not correspond to any obvious practical function. Tools in configurations that suggest placement rather than use. Ceramic vessels positioned with their openings facing a specific direction. Articulated animal remains in positions inconsistent with butchering or casual disposal. These are not fabrications. They are in excavation reports from the early and mid-20th century, written by archaeologists who were describing what they found without necessarily having a framework for interpreting it. The interpretive gap between what was found and what it meant is still open in most of these cases. One of the most persistently discussed examples in the serious literature, though rarely discussed in terms that reach a general audience, concerns a complex of underground spaces in the Angus district, reported in multiple stages between 1887 and 1934. The initial discovery was in 1887 during drainage work on a farm whose records have been partially traced, but whose specific location is now under dispute because subsequent land consolidation altered the field boundaries and the placing O-field. Original survey coordinates do not map cleanly onto the process. Current cadastral record. The initial report, written by the Farm Factor and forwarded to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, describes a chamber approximately 15 feet in diameter with a ceiling height at the apex of approximately 9 feet, flagged floor, dry stone walls corbelled inward in a style the Factor compared to the technique he had seen in Orkney chambered cairns, and 3 narrow passages leading off from the main chamber in different directions. 2 of the passages were blocked within feet of the main chamber. The third extended further than the lamp illuminated. The Factor estimated it went at least 40 feet before he chose not to continue. The Society acknowledged receipt of the report. There is no record of a site visit in 1887. In 1903, a local schoolmaster named in the Society's correspondence as D. Mackintosh revisited what he believed was the same site, based on the 1,887 reports' description of landmarks, found the original entry had been sealed, but identified what he described as a second entry point, approximately 30 feet north of where the original should have been. He descended into a space that he described as consistent with the 1,887 report, though he could not be certain it was the same chamber or a connected one. His report to the Society is more detailed than the original. He describes the corbelling technique at length, notes that the stones used are a consistent lithology that does not match the local surface geology, and observes that the worked surfaces of the stone have a weathering pattern consistent with considerable age rather than recent construction. He does not speculate on a period. He simply notes the discrepancy between the stone's apparent age and any construction date he could account for. In 1934, a third contact with what appears to be the same complex occurred, this time during the installation of a field drainage system by a contractor working for the district council. A chamber was broken into during pipe installation, partially destroyed before work stopped, and the remaining portion documented by an archaeologist from Dundee who was telephoned by the contractor's supervisor. The 1,934 report describes a space consistent in general dimensions with the 1,887 account, an entry passage that had been blocked with carefully placed stone, and a floor deposit that included fragments of pottery the archaeologist dated on stylistic grounds to the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. He also noted, in a parenthetical that the formal report does not expand on, that the corbelling technique appeared to him inconsistent with Bronze Age construction in Scotland as he understood it, and that one section of wall showed evidence of reworking at a date later than the original construction, as if the chamber had been modified or repaired during a period of reuse. No further investigation followed. The drainage installation was completed. The chamber was sealed under the pipe route. This sequence, initial discovery, inadequate response, rediscovery, inadequate response again, accidental destruction, partial documentation, permanent loss, is not unique to this particular complex. It is the standard trajectory of anomalous underground discoveries in Scotland across the period from 1,800 to the present. The pattern is not a conspiracy. It is the product of limited resources, competing priorities, institutional inertia, and the fundamental awkwardness that comes from finding something that does not fit the framework and having no efficient mechanism for admitting that the framework may need adjustment. Institutions, including academic ones, tend to process anomalies by assimilating them into existing categories rather than allowing them to destabilize the categories. The anomalous chamber gets called a souterrain. The unusual stonework gets attributed to regional variation. The sealed condition gets explained as structural necessity. The non-local lithology gets noted and not pursued. The entry is filed, and the file stays in the archive. The archive itself is the next part of this conversation. The documentary record of Scottish underground discoveries is distributed across multiple repositories that are not fully cross-referenced. The National Records of Scotland hold estate records, factors accounts, and 19th century survey documents. The Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland maintains the Canmore database, which is the most comprehensive publicly accessible record of Scottish archaeological sites and is genuinely useful, but which reflects what has been formally reported and is notably thin on the anomalous material that never entered the formal reporting pipeline. University collections, particularly those at Edinburgh, Aberdeen, St Andrews, and Dundee, hold correspondence and fieldwork records from individual researchers that sometimes contain material not reflected in any formal publication. The Society of Antiquaries of Scotland archive, held at the National Museum of Scotland, is the single most important repository for the 19th and early 20th century material, and has been only partially catalogued in accessible form. The anomalous chamber material that exists in these archives is not hidden. It is findable. It requires knowing where to look, which requires having a reason to look, which requires someone deciding that the anomalous material is worth the time. That decision has been made by a small number of researchers over the years, and the results of their work exist in forms that range from peer-reviewed papers to unpublished dissertations to privately circulated typescripts that were never formally published because the findings were considered too speculative for the venues available to the authors. The speculative charge is worth examining because it has done a significant amount of damage to this field over the decades. Speculation in archaeology is not automatically a problem. Every archaeological interpretation involves speculation. The question is whether the speculation is proportionate to the evidence and clearly labelled as such. What happened in the underground chamber literature is that a minority of researchers made claims that went well beyond what the evidence supported, linking the chambers to lost civilizations, pre-Celtic migrations from the Mediterranean, Atlantean influences, and similar frameworks that are not supported by the physical evidence and that imported assumptions from outside the Scottish archaeological record. These overclaims, which received disproportionate popular attention because they were dramatic, then tainted the entire conversation. Serious researchers who were making more modest and defensible claims about chamber construction techniques, dating anomalies, and classification problems found themselves lumped in with the fringe literature and treated with corresponding skepticism. The result was a retreat. Serious researchers stopped publishing on the anomalous material because the cost to their credibility was too high. The field contracted. The archive stopped receiving new contributions on the difficult questions, and the chambers sat in the ground, unexamined, continuing not to fit the categories assigned to them. This is a pattern that repeats in every field where the anomalous evidence is real, but the institutional cost of taking it seriously is high. The researchers who would be best placed to investigate are the ones with the most to lose from association with a topic that has been contaminated by fringe claims. The researchers without institutional stakes are the ones who do invest time in the topic, but they often lack the methodological rigor or the access to physical evidence that would allow them to produce work capable of changing the professional consensus. The result is a standoff that serves no one well. The anomalous evidence does not get properly investigated. The fringe claims do not get properly refuted because proper refutation requires engaging with the evidence seriously. And the public, left to navigate between overclaiming enthusiasts and dismissive professionals, is not well served by either. There is a specific researcher whose work on Scottish underground chambers is worth knowing about, though naming is less important than the pattern of their career. Over approximately 20 years of part-time fieldwork, conducted alongside a full-time academic appointment in a related but not identical field, this researcher compiled a dataset of over 300 documented underground chamber discoveries in Scotland from the period 1780 to 1970, cross-referenced against the known Souterrains inventory, and identified a subset of approximately 60 cases where the dimensions, construction technique, geological context, or associated finds were sufficiently anomalous to merit further investigation. The dataset was presented at 2 conferences and published in summary form in a regional archaeology journal that does not have wide circulation. The full dataset, which represents decades of archival work, has not been published in a form that would make it accessible to other researchers, partly because the researcher retired before completing the intended monograph, and partly because no publisher was willing to commit to a topic that sat at the edge of academic respectability. The dataset exists. Copies of it are held by a small number of colleagues. It is the best systematic attempt to map the anomalous material that has been made, and most people working in Scottish prehistoric archaeology have never heard of it. Let's go north. The Scottish Highlands, and specifically the area of Sutherland and Caithness, represent a different dimension of this conversation. Caithness is flat, peat-covered, geologically distinct from the rest of the Highlands, and has a surface archaeology dominated by circular stone structures, clearance cairns, and field systems whose date and purpose are still debated. It is also an area where the peat cover is thick enough to have preserved subsurface conditions that are unusual. Beneath Caithness peat, in various locations, archaeological investigation has revealed floor surfaces, structural remains, and in several instances void spaces that were not expected based on surface evidence. The void spaces in Caithness are in a different geological context than the rock-cut chambers of Angus or the Orkney cairns, because the substrate is primarily old red sandstone with overlying peat and glacial till. Voids in this context can have multiple origins, but the documented cases where the void is clearly a constructed space rather than a natural feature, evidenced by worked stone, deliberate floor preparation, and entry configurations are on record and have not been fully explained. Sutherland's underground record is thinner in documentation, but significant in what it contains. The area known as the Flow Country, which spans the border between Sutherland and Caithness and represents the largest expanse of blanket bog in Europe, is extraordinarily difficult to survey. The peat depth ranges from 1 to several meters across much of the area, and sub-peat topography is essentially invisible from the surface. Drone-mounted ground-penetrating radar surveys have been conducted in limited areas for research purposes not primarily related to archaeology, and some of these surveys have returned anomalies in the sub-peat substrate that are consistent with constructed features. None of these anomalies have been excavated. Excavation in deep blanket bog is technically and logistically demanding, expensive, and requires a clear research rationale that can justify the cost. The anomalies remain in the survey data, noted and unexamined. The question of who could have built underground chambers in Scotland, at whatever period the anomalous examples date to, is the question that generates the most resistance, because answering it requires engaging with the prehistory of Scotland in ways that complicate the standard narrative. The standard narrative, stated simply, goes something like this. Scotland was populated after the last glacial maximum by successive waves of migration from mainland Europe. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers arrived first, followed by Neolithic farming communities from the continent who brought with them the knowledge of large-scale stone architecture evidenced at Orkney and elsewhere. Bronze Age and Iron Age populations followed, culturally and to varying degrees genetically distinct from their predecessors. The Celts arrived in the Iron Age, or possibly earlier, bringing the languages ancestral to modern Scottish Gaelic and the Brittonic languages. Roman influence was limited and mostly confined to the south. The Picts are a persistent puzzle, but are broadly categorized within the Iron Age framework. Norse settlement from the 9th century onward is well documented in the north and west. And from these populations, in these sequences, the documented historic record of Scotland develops. This narrative is not wrong in its broad strokes. It is supported by substantial archaeological and genetic evidence. But it is a narrative built primarily from surface evidence and from sites and periods where the evidence has been actively sought. Its gaps are the gaps where evidence has not been sought, or where evidence has been found and not fully incorporated. Ancient DNA research in the last decade has complicated the population history of Britain in ways that are still being worked through. The Neolithic transition in Britain involved a population replacement that was more complete than previously understood. The people who built the chambered cairns of Orkney, Maeshowe included, were essentially replaced by Bronze Age migrations from the continent to an extent that left their genetic signal almost entirely absent in modern British populations. This means the builders of Neolithic Scotland's most sophisticated stone architecture were not the ancestors of anyone living in Scotland today in a meaningful genetic sense. They were a people who came, built extraordinary things, and were then replaced or absorbed to near invisibility. What they knew about underground construction, what tradition of knowledge informed the precision of Maeshowe's alignment and the skill of its stonework, that knowledge either transferred to the incoming Bronze Age populations, or it did not. If it did not transfer, then certain capabilities present in Neolithic Scotland were simply lost, and everything built with those capabilities postdates the populations who had them. If it did transfer, then the incoming Bronze Age population was building on a foundation of knowledge whose origins were Neolithic and whose full extent we do not know. This is not fringe speculation. This is the implication of the ancient DNA evidence as it currently stands, extended into the question of underground construction knowledge. The chambers that do not fit the Iron Age souterrain model might fit an earlier model, whose physical traces are less well mapped. The quality of corbelling, the precision of flagging, the selection of non-local stone, these could be characteristics of a construction tradition older than the population contexts in which the chambers are found, passed forward through cultural transmission across genetic boundaries. Archaeology has documented cultural transmission across genetic replacement in other contexts. It is not impossible. It may, in the Scottish underground chamber case, be the most parsimonious explanation available. The role of water in all of this is worth a sustained discussion, because it is both a practical factor in chamber preservation and a dimension of the sites that the records consistently note without fully explaining. Many of the anomalous chambers in Scotland are in close relationship with water, not in the sense of being flooded or waterlogged, but in the sense of being positioned relative to springs, streams, or natural water collection points in ways that suggest the relationship was intentional. Springs in particular recur in the accounts. A chamber is found adjacent to or directly above a spring. The spring's output is directed through the chamber or around it, or the chamber is positioned so that the spring is accessible from within but does not flood the interior. This relationship between underground chambers and springs is well documented in European prehistoric contexts broadly. Springs were significant places in many pre-Christian traditions. They were associated with healing, with access to an underworld, with liminal states. In Scotland specifically, the Christianization of the landscape involved a sustained effort to absorb pre-Christian sacred geography by dedicating springs to saints, a pattern so consistent and so geographically widespread that it is itself evidence of the density and significance of the pre-Christian spring tradition it replaced. If underground chambers are positioned in deliberate relationship to springs, that positioning carries implications about the function and meaning of the chambers that go beyond storage. There is a specific category of Scottish underground space that is neither souterrain nor natural cave, nor the anomalous constructed chambers discussed so far, and that deserves its own space in this conversation. These are the carved or shaped natural chambers, spaces that began as natural voids in the rock and were subsequently worked to modify their dimensions, surfaces, or entry configurations. Scotland's geology produces natural caves in several contexts. Limestone caves occur in localized areas. Sea caves are found extensively on the western and northern coastlines. Rock shelters formed by overhanging cliff faces or detached boulder formations are found across the highlands and islands. What makes some of these natural spaces relevant to the underground chamber discussion is evidence of deliberate human modification that goes beyond simple habitation. Smoothed wall surfaces, carved channels, shaped entry points that required removing material from the natural opening to achieve a specific configuration. In some cases, carved symbols or markings on interior surfaces that are not explainable as later graffiti and that share characteristics with known Neolithic and Bronze Age symbolic traditions. The carved symbols in underground contexts are a topic that requires care, because the literature on rock art in Scotland is both extensive and contested, and the underground carved symbol material sits in a particularly difficult analytical position. Surface rock carvings in Scotland, the cup marks, cup and ring marks, and more complex linear designs associated primarily with the Neolithic and Bronze Age, have been studied in detail. There is a body of research on their distribution, their relationship to landscape features, and their possible functions, though the functions remain debated. Underground carved symbols, by contrast, have been documented sporadically, in contexts where preservation conditions vary and where access for systematic survey has been difficult. In some cases, the symbols in underground contexts are recognizably similar to known surface types, which supports the inference that they date to the same broad periods and traditions. In other cases, the symbols are less clearly related to known types, or occur in combinations or contexts that do not have obvious parallels in the surface corpus. These are not fabrications. They are in the literature. They have been described and illustrated by researchers who were not arguing for any particular exotic interpretation, who were simply recording what they found and noting that the interpretive framework was inadequate. Here is a case that illustrates the pattern without requiring any extraordinary claims. In the early 1960s, a researcher working on a broader survey of cave sites in the Scottish borders encountered, in the context of a natural rock shelter on a hillside in what was then an agricultural area, a portion of the shelter's back wall that had been smoothed and on which a series of carved marks were present. The marks were not immediately recognizable as any known rock art type, but were clearly deliberate, deeply incised, and showed weathering consistent with considerable antiquity. The researcher photographed and measured what was visible, made drawings, and included a description in a survey report that was subsequently published as part of a larger volume on border archaeology. The volume has a limited print run, is held in a handful of specialist libraries, and has never been digitized. The site itself, the researcher noted in correspondence preserved in a university archive, was subsequently damaged when the shelter was used as a dumping point during land clearance, and the carved surface was partially covered and partially broken by the deposited material. No follow-up survey of the carved surface was ever conducted. The photographs and drawings in the survey volume remain the only record of what was there. This is not dramatic. It is not mysterious in the conspiratorial sense. It is simply a loss. A small loss in absolute terms, one carved surface among many things that have been lost. But multiplied across the number of such events that the archival record implies, across the number of chambers discovered and inadequately recorded or destroyed before recording could be completed, the cumulative loss becomes significant, not because each individual loss proves something extraordinary was suppressed, but because the cumulative loss means that the question of what was in Scotland's underground record cannot be answered with the evidence that survives. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and in Scotland's underground archaeology, the absence is not random. It is the absence created by a consistent pattern of inadequate response to discoveries that did not fit the expected framework. Let's go to Orkney again, because Orkney deserves more than a mention. The Ness of Brodgar, excavated progressively since 2004 and still ongoing, has revised the understanding of Neolithic Orkney in ways that are still being digested. The Ness is a monumental stone complex on the promontory between the Loch of Stenness and the Loch of Harray, sitting between the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stenness, and it represents a scale of organized architectural effort that was not anticipated before excavation began. The buildings at the Ness are large, some of them very large, with walls of extraordinary thickness and internal features indicating repeated use, modification, and ultimately deliberate, structured decommissioning. The decommissioning, the deliberate backfilling and closure of the Ness buildings is itself significant, because it is a pattern of closure that shares characteristics with what the underground chamber records describe. Something was built, used, and then deliberately ended, with the ending requiring as much organized effort as the building. The Ness of Brodgar does not have documented underground chambers in the anomalous sense, but geophysical surveys of the broader promontory have identified subsurface features that have not been excavated, and the scale of the complex above ground makes it reasonable to ask whether there are associated below-ground features. The question has been raised by researchers involved in the project and has not been definitively answered because the excavation priority has been the above-ground features whose presence is already confirmed. This is a rational prioritization of resources. It does not preclude the subsurface features being significant. The two things are compatible. The broader landscape of Orkney has been subject to increasingly detailed geophysical survey in recent years, partly as a consequence of the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation for the heart of Neolithic Orkney, which has stimulated both research interest and funding availability. These surveys have expanded the known distribution of prehistoric features significantly and have identified subsurface anomalies at multiple locations around the main monument complex and elsewhere on mainland Orkney and on the other islands. The published survey reports are careful in their language. Anomalies are classified by type, positive or negative signature, estimated depth and dimensions, probable material if distinguishable, without claiming certainty about their nature. Chambered structures are identified as one possible explanation for some categories of anomaly. Excavation would be required to confirm or refute any specific interpretation. The funding and logistics for such excavation have not been assembled. The anomalies remain in the data. There is a dimension of the Scottish underground chamber question that is almost never discussed in the academic literature and occasionally discussed in the popular literature in ways that are not always accurate, which is the relationship between underground spaces and the historical record of Scottish communities' use of them. Scotland has a turbulent history of conflict, clearance, and displacement, and underground spaces have been used within recorded history as places of concealment, refuge, and resistance. The history of the Highland clearances, the forced displacement of communities from the land in favour of sheep farming, primarily in the 18th and 19th centuries, is documented, and its scale is understood. What is less often discussed is the degree to which communities facing clearance used their knowledge of the landscape's underground resources as part of their response, storing objects, hiding people, and maintaining access to spaces that were not visible to those enforcing the clearances. This use of underground spaces in the clearances context is documented in oral tradition and in a small number of written accounts, and it is relevant because it means that, in the 19th century, when the drainage campaigns that produced many of the anomalous chamber discoveries were also underway, the underground landscape of Scotland was simultaneously being discovered by surveyors and being used by communities who knew things about it that the surveyors did not. The oral traditions of Scottish Highland and Island communities carry information about underground spaces that is not systematically reflected in the formal archaeological record. This is not surprising. Oral tradition is the information management system of communities whose knowledge was not primarily written. The traditions describe underground passages between specific locations, some of which have been partially confirmed by subsequent discovery of connected chambers or passage sections. They describe the characteristics of certain underground spaces in terms of their spiritual or protective significance. They describe practices associated with underground spaces that suggest sustained use over long periods for purposes that were not purely practical. None of this constitutes archaeological evidence in the technical sense, but dismissing it as folklore and stopping there is an analytical choice, not a factual conclusion. Oral traditions have been shown, in multiple documented cases across Scotland and elsewhere, to carry accurate information about physical features of the landscape over time periods that exceed what is intuitive. The Gaelic traditions of the Western Isles and the Highland communities carry an archive of landscape knowledge whose relationship to the underground chamber record has not been systematically examined. The Picts complicate everything, and they do so deliberately, in the sense that the Pictish civilization was highly literate in its own symbolic system, while leaving almost no textual record that can be read in the modern sense. The symbol stones are extraordinary. The distribution of symbol stones across the Pictish geographic core, from the Firth of Forth to Shetland, is well documented. The symbols are clearly systematic. They recur across a wide area and a substantial time span in consistent combinations, suggesting they encode information of some structured kind. But the encoding system has not been cracked. What the Picts did underground is almost entirely unknown. Their above-ground architecture is poorly preserved because they built primarily in timber and earth rather than stone, with the exception of the brochs, which are not specifically Pictish, but overlap chronologically and geographically with the Pictish period. Whether the Picts constructed underground chambers, modified pre-existing ones, or had a relationship with the underground landscape that their symbol system reflects, none of this can be stated with confidence because the evidence is insufficient. What can be said is that the distribution of anomalous underground chamber reports in the historical record correlates significantly with the core Pictish geographic zone. This correlation does not prove Pictish construction. It could reflect the accident of discovery patterns, since the most agriculturally active and therefore most excavated areas of Scotland in the 19th century were also the Pictish heartland. But the correlation is real and has been noted. If some proportion of the anomalous chambers date to the Pictish period, that would be consistent with what is known of Pictish cultural sophistication in other domains. The Picts who produced the symbol stones were capable of sustained intellectual and artistic effort on a scale that suggests organizational complexity well beyond what is sometimes assumed. Underground construction would not be inconsistent with that capability. There is a specific site in Perthshire that has appeared in the underground chamber literature repeatedly over the last 100 years without ever being fully resolved. The site is in the foothills northeast of Perth, in agricultural country that has been farmed continuously since at least the medieval period. The first reference to an underground chamber at this location appears in an estate survey from 1829, which describes a space encountered during the digging of a new drainage outfall as being approximately 12 feet across, with walls of worked stone and a low entry passage that required crawling. The estate survey notes that the space had been known locally before its re-exposure, that older residents of the estate recalled their own parents or grandparents knowing of it, and that there was a local name for the space in Scots Gaelic that the surveyor rendered phonetically but did not translate. The translation of that phonetic rendering is ambiguous, but several scholars who have examined the passage have suggested it refers to a House of the Old Ones or similar construction, which would imply community knowledge of the chamber's antiquity, predating the 1829 re-exposure by at least several generations. The same site was referenced in 1891 by a local antiquarian who published a note in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, describing a visit to a chamber he believed to be the same location. His description matches the 1829 account in general terms but adds detail. He describes a second, smaller chamber, connected to the main one by a low passage, a central depression in the floor of the main chamber that he interpreted as a possible hearth position, and a section of wall in which 2 or 3 stones had been removed and replaced in a more recent period. An observation suggesting the chamber had been accessed within the antiquarian's historical memory, which he estimated at no more than 2 or 3 generations prior. He expressed puzzlement about the chamber's function and date, noted that it was too large and too isolated to be a souterrain in the conventional sense, and concluded his note by suggesting it warranted systematic excavation. No systematic excavation followed. In 1953, a geologist working in the area on a soil survey encountered a depression in a field that corresponded approximately to the location of the earlier accounts, broke through the surface crust into a void, and lowered himself into what he described in a letter to a colleague. The letter is in the colleague's papers, held at a university archive, as a stone-lined chamber with a corbelled ceiling partially collapsed on one side. He estimated the intact portion of the chamber was approximately 10 to 12 feet across. He found no artifacts in the portion accessible to him. He noted that the stone of the corbelling was a dark, fine-grained rock unlike the local Perthshire geology, and described the surface of the worked stones as having a patina, consistent in his judgment with very considerable age. He did not report the discovery formally, primarily because he was a geologist, not an archaeologist, and was uncertain of the correct procedure. The letter survives. The chamber presumably does as well, in whatever condition it is currently in, below a field in Perthshire that looks completely unremarkable from the surface. Now there is the question of the Hebridean Black House tradition and its relationship to the underground record. The Black House, the traditional stone longhouse of the Western Isles, built with double walls and a thatched roof, is a building type that has deep roots in the Atlantic Scottish landscape. What is less often discussed in popular accounts is the degree to which Black House settlements routinely incorporated underground features, storage pits, drainage channels, in some cases, small chambers below floor level used for various practical purposes. The integration of above-ground and below-ground architecture in traditional Hebridean building practice is evidence of a long-standing familiarity with underground space as a functional element of settlement design. This familiarity does not explain the anomalous chambers, but it provides context for understanding that in the Scottish Atlantic cultural tradition, going underground was normal, familiar, and practically integrated in ways that are easy to miss if you are looking only at the above-ground evidence. Lewis has produced some of the more interesting documented cases of underground spaces associated with surface structures in ways that go beyond the standard Black House pit. In several recorded instances, excavation of historical settlement sites on Lewis has revealed below-floor chambers that are too large and too carefully constructed to be interpreted as simple storage pits, and that, in some cases, predate the surface settlement above them by a margin that the stratigraphic evidence supports but does not allow precise quantification. In one published excavation report from the 1970s, a below-floor chamber at a site on the west coast of Lewis is described as having walls constructed in a technique the excavator characterized as significantly older than the medieval occupation above, with a floor deposit that contained material ranging from what appeared to be Neolithic in date to medieval. The interpretation offered was that the chamber had been in continuous or intermittent use across an extraordinarily long period, with each phase of users aware of and making use of a space that had been constructed in an earlier period. The chamber was approximately 8 feet in diameter, had a flagged floor, and a corbelled ceiling that was partially intact. The excavation was limited in scope, and the report was published in a regional journal that is now difficult to access. The site has not been re-excavated. This pattern of long-term continuity of use at underground sites is one of the more interesting threads in the Scottish chamber record because it suggests that, whatever the original construction purpose was, the spaces remained known and accessible to subsequent populations across periods of substantial cultural change. A space that was built in the Neolithic or Bronze Age and was still being accessed in the medieval period, was not a lost discovery. It was a maintained tradition. Communities knew where it was, knew how to access it, and found reasons to continue using it across the centuries. This kind of long-term continuity is not without parallel in the archaeological record broadly. The maintenance and reuse of prehistoric monuments across subsequent periods is well documented in Britain and Ireland. What is specific to the underground examples is that this continuity was invisible from the surface. The communities who maintained these spaces did so without leaving surface markers that would have attracted external notice or interference. Whether that invisibility was incidental or deliberate is another question that cannot be answered with the available evidence. The geology of the Western Isles, specifically the Lewisian gneiss basement that underlies much of Lewis and Harris and the Uists, creates underground conditions that are worth spending some time on. Lewisian gneiss is a metamorphic rock of extraordinary hardness and extremely low porosity. It does not dissolve, it does not easily fracture, and it does not support the kind of groundwater circulation that creates natural cave systems in limestone. Chambers in Lewisian gneiss are not naturally formed. Any void in Lewisian gneiss that has dimensions consistent with human occupation was made by human effort. This is a straightforward geological fact. The effort required to create even a modest chamber in Lewisian gneiss, using the tools available before the introduction of iron, or even in the Iron Age, is substantial. It requires sustained effort, specialized knowledge of the rock's fracture patterns, and the use of fire setting, wedging, or other techniques that leave characteristic marks on the worked surfaces. The presence of such chambers in the Western Isles, and the documented cases where they have been found, implies a level of organized effort whose scale and sophistication is not always appreciated. There is a researcher who spent several years in the 1990s attempting to assess the energetic cost of the underground chamber construction documented in the Scottish Western Isles record, using experimental archaeology methods combined with analysis of the physical evidence from the most thoroughly documented sites. The work was never published as a full monograph, though a summary appeared in a conference proceedings volume. The conclusion was that the construction of the larger documented chambers in Lewisian gneiss or comparable hard rock substrates would have required organized labor investment comparable to what is estimated for the construction of the surface megalithic monuments of the same period and region. This is a significant conclusion because it means the underground chamber tradition, if it is a tradition, was not a minor or marginal activity. It was a major investment. Major investments are made for reasons that matter. Storage is a reason. Ritual or sacred function is a reason. Defense or concealment is a reason. Political or social signaling is a reason. The chambers were built for reasons that were important to the communities that built them, at a cost that was high enough to require organizational capacity beyond the individual or the household. Let's come back to something practical. If someone were to attempt a systematic investigation of the anomalous Scottish underground chamber record today, what would that look like? The resources exist, in principle, to do this properly. Ground-penetrating radar and its more sophisticated relatives, including electrical resistivity, tomography, and seismic reflection, have been used successfully in Scottish archaeology at sites ranging from the Ness of Brodgar to the Antonine Wall. The technology is not inexpensive, but it is not prohibitively so for a properly funded research project. The archival work to compile the existing reports into a usable dataset is time-consuming but feasible, and a significant amount of the relevant material is now in institutions that have active digitization programs, meaning accessibility is improving. The regulatory framework for archaeological investigation in Scotland is robust and provides mechanisms for the protection and investigation of sites that are at risk, though it also creates bureaucratic processes that slow field research. The combination of technology, archive access, and regulatory framework suggests that a systematic investigation is possible. The constraint is institutional will and funding priority. The question of who should lead such an investigation is itself not trivial. In the current Scottish archaeological landscape, the anomalous chamber material sits in an awkward space between academic respectability and public interest. Academic respectability favours narrow, well-defined research questions that can be addressed within a single funding cycle and published in peer-reviewed venues with clear methodological standards. The anomalous chamber material is by definition diffuse, geographically distributed, and resistant to easy methodological framing, because the first step would have to be verifying that the anomalies are real, which requires engaging with the archival material on its own terms, and with the field evidence at sites that are in varying states of accessibility and preservation. This is not the shape of a project that competes well for funding against a project that promises a clearly defined excavation of a known site with predictable outputs. Public interest, on the other hand, is high. Scotland's underground mysteries generate significant popular attention, most of it focused on a small number of well-known examples, including the Edinburgh Underground City, which is a historical phenomenon of the 18th century and is not directly relevant to the prehistoric chamber question, and a handful of other sites that have achieved popular profile through books and television programs. The popular attention is not always well informed, and the connection to fringe literature that has attached itself to the topic creates a reputational problem for anyone attempting to engage with it seriously. But the public interest is real and represents a potential funding and advocacy base that has not been effectively organized around the serious scientific question. The most promising model for the kind of investigation the anomalous chamber material deserves is probably community academic partnership, of the sort that has been successfully developed at a number of Scottish prehistoric sites in recent years. The Ness of Brodgar project has been partly funded by public donations and has engaged communities in the research process in ways that have both improved the science and built a constituency for continued work. A similarly structured project focused on the underground chamber record could draw on local knowledge, community historical archives, and public interest, while maintaining the methodological rigor that the academic environment requires. It would need an institutional home willing to take the reputational risk of engaging with a topic that has been associated with fringe claims. It would need researchers with the specific skills to navigate the archival material, conduct geophysical surveys, and interpret the results in context. And it would need enough sustained funding to cover the time required to do the archival work before the fieldwork, because rushing to the field without the archival groundwork is the mistake that has been made repeatedly in this area, and that has contributed to the fragmented and inadequate state of the existing record. The seasonal character of fieldwork in Scotland is itself a constraint worth acknowledging. Scotland's climate is not cooperative for extended field seasons. The window for comfortable outdoor survey and excavation is limited, the ground conditions in many relevant areas are wet for much of the year, and the remoteness of some of the most interesting locations requires logistical preparation that extends lead times significantly. These are not insurmountable obstacles. Scottish archaeology manages them at many sites every year, but they add to the cost and complexity of any investigation and need to be budgeted realistically rather than optimistically. Outside the academic and institutional frame, there are individuals who have contributed to the knowledge base through systematic personal observation and documentation. Scotland has a strong tradition of local historians and amateur archaeologists whose familiarity with specific landscapes has allowed them to identify features and compile records that professional surveys have missed or not prioritized. Several of the most interesting, anomalous chamber cases in the historical record were first documented by exactly this kind of person: a schoolmaster, a factor, a geologist working on an unrelated survey, a local historian following a specific thread in the estate records. The contemporary equivalent of this tradition is alive in Scotland, in the form of people who walk specific landscapes regularly and who document what they find with the improved tools of digital photography, GPS, and online sharing platforms. Some of these people are in contact with professional archaeologists, some are not. The information they generate is not always in forms that can be directly incorporated into formal research, but it is a resource that a serious investigation of the anomalous chamber record should find ways to engage with rather than ignore. There is one more thing to say about the chambers themselves, about what it means to be inside one, for the people who have been. The accounts in the historical record, from the factor's letter to the geologist's correspondence to the antiquarian's journal, share a quality that is not always present in archaeological reports, which is an affect of disorientation. The people who went into these spaces and wrote about them afterwards described a quality of stillness, of separation from the surface world, that they found difficult to characterize. The factor wrote about the silence being of a different quality than ordinary silence. The geologist described the air as completely still, in a way that felt to him deliberately so, rather than simply the absence of wind. The antiquarian wrote that he felt the space had been intended to be entered, but that the entering was supposed to mean something beyond the physical act of going underground. These are subjective responses. They are not data in the scientific sense, but they are part of the record, and they are consistent across accounts, separated by decades, and written by people with no particular reason to embellish in the same direction. The chambers produce a specific response in the people who encounter them. That response is not universal, but it is common enough to be worth noting. Scotland is a landscape that holds its history differently than more temperate or more frequently disturbed landscapes. The hard rock, the deep peat, the cold and the wet that seem like enemies of preservation but are, in many contexts, exactly what preservation requires. The things that are in the ground in Scotland have been there for a very long time, and in many cases are in better condition than might be expected, precisely because the conditions that make it hard to work in Scotland are also the best, conditions that protect what is already there. The chambers in the ground, the ones documented and the ones not yet found, are waiting in that preserved condition. They are not going anywhere. They have demonstrated considerable patience already. The question is whether the surface world will eventually find the sustained interest to go and properly meet them. The evidence that exists, the archival records, the partial excavations, the geophysical surveys, the oral traditions, the geological analyses, none of it proves that Scotland's underground record contains anything that would fundamentally rewrite the prehistory of the country, but none of it proves that it doesn't. The evidence is insufficient to decide in either direction, and the insufficiency is not inevitable. It is the product of choices that were made at specific moments. Choices not to investigate, not to fund, not to prioritize, not to publish. Those choices can be different in the future. The archive can be compiled, the surveys can be conducted. The excavations, where they are possible and appropriate, can be carried out. The communities whose traditions carry knowledge about the underground landscape can be included in the conversation rather than consulted as an afterthought. All of this is possible. It requires the same organized effort that the original construction required, directed at understanding rather than building, but organized and sustained in the same way. Scotland's underground chambers are not a mystery in the sense of being inherently unknowable. They are a mystery in the practical sense of not yet having been known, because the effort required to know them has not been made. That is a different kind of mystery. It is the kind that can, in principle, be resolved. The ground is patient. The records exist, partially, imperfectly, in archives and correspondence, and published notes that are scattered but findable. The technology to look without destructive excavation is available and improving. The only thing required is the decision that these questions are worth answering. That decision has not yet been definitively made. It could be. The last thing worth saying is about the particular texture of Scottish underground space as a cultural fact. Scotland is a country with a profound relationship to what is hidden, to landscape as a repository of the past, to the idea that surfaces do not tell the whole story of a place. This is present in the literature, in the music, in the relationship to land that persists even in communities that have been disconnected from specific territories by historical disruption. The underground chambers are part of that cultural texture. They are not separate from it. They are one expression of a much longer human relationship with the space beneath the surface of Scotland, a relationship that began before any written record exists to describe it, and that continues in the form of the questions that are still open. The chambers are the questions made physical. They are the evidence that something was here, was organized and capable, had reasons for what it built, and sealed those reasons behind carefully placed stone. The stone is still there, some of it anyway. The questions are still open, all of them. The night settles over the Scottish hills in a particular way. The sky in the far north goes a kind of dark that cities cannot manage, deep and uninterrupted, and the land below it becomes a different thing than it is by day. Under that sky, under the surface that looks in the darkness like an unbroken plain, the chambers are there in the rock and the old clay, dry in most of them, still aired, sealed or open, containing what they contain, and not giving it up without being properly asked. The records in the archives are there in the same way, patient in their folders and their microfilm and their digitized pages, waiting for someone to compile them into a coherent picture. The oral traditions are there in the communities, held by people who know things they may not know they know, available to the right conversation. Everything required to begin properly understanding this is present. None of it is lost yet. Most of it is simply waiting. And somewhere in Angus, or Lewis, or Caithness, or Perthshire, there is a field that looks like every other field, flat and ordinary in the morning light, and below it, at a depth that a metre or two of soil and old till has kept invisible for however many centuries it has been invisible, there is a chamber, flagged floor, corbelled ceiling, air that is still and dry, walls of stone fitted with a care that the person who fitted them brought to the work deliberately and with knowledge. The chamber does not know it is mysterious. It is simply there. It has always simply been there. It is waiting for the question that takes it seriously. If you are still here with me, still listening to this somewhere in the quiet of wherever you are, I want you to know that this is exactly the kind of question I think is worth sitting with. Not because it proves something dramatic, but because the honest uncertainty of it, the gaps in the record that are real gaps rather than manufactured ones, the possibility that the ground beneath a country holds more than the current maps acknowledge, that is something worth carrying. Maybe subscribe, if this is the kind of thing you want more of. And if you are somewhere interesting right now, somewhere with its own old ground and its own unanswered questions, drop that in the comments. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I'll be here. To understand why the Scottish underground chamber record is so persistently difficult to resolve, it helps to understand the structure of Scottish archaeological practice as it developed over the 19th and 20th centuries. Scottish archaeology was not a unified discipline from the start. It emerged from several overlapping traditions. Antiquarianism, which was primarily the preserve of educated gentlemen interested in the physical traces of the past without any consistent methodological framework. Geology, which was advancing rapidly through the 19th century and which generated many incidental discoveries of underground features during field survey, and classical scholarship, which provided the dominant intellectual framework for interpreting antiquity through the lens of Greece and Rome, and which was poorly equipped to handle evidence from a pre-classical culture that left no interpretable texts. These three traditions intersected awkwardly, and the points of intersection produced documents that are simultaneously valuable and frustrating. Valuable because they record things that would otherwise be entirely lost. Frustrating because the framework brought to the recording was not adequate to the material being recorded. The Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, founded in 1780, was the primary institutional home for Scottish archaeological activity through much of the 19th century and into the 20th. The Society published its proceedings from 1851 onward, and the proceedings constitute the most significant single archive for Scottish antiquarian and early archaeological discovery from that period. Reading the proceedings across the decades that concern us reveals a pattern that is recognizable once you know to look for it. Underground discoveries are reported. They are noted. Brief discussion follows. The discussion does not resolve the questions the discovery raises. The discovery is filed, and the proceedings move on to the next item. The reason is not indifference, exactly. It is the absence of a methodological framework capable of processing what was found. The tools to date a chamber precisely were not available until radiocarbon dating became standard in the 1950s, and even then, dating the construction of a chamber requires finding datable material directly associated with the construction event, which is not always possible. Without precise dating, chambers could not be placed in their cultural context with confidence, and without cultural context, the interpretation of function and meaning was guesswork. The proceedings record the guesswork honestly, which is to its credit, and then move on, which is to its limitation. The radiocarbon revolution of the 1950s changed this in principle, but the application to underground chamber material was slow. The first priority in Scottish archaeology, after the introduction of radiocarbon dating, was the dating of the known major monument classes, the chambered cairns of Orkney and the Clyde region, the stone circles, the hill forts. These were the sites with the highest profile and the clearest research programs. The anomalous underground chambers were not a research program. They were a category of incidental discovery with no organized academic home. By the time the research priorities were established and the funding cycles were running, the anomalous chamber material was already in an awkward position, simultaneously too uncertain to include in confident research proposals and too interesting to entirely ignore. The researchers who might have made it their focus generally found that the professional risk was too high relative to the career benefit, and so the gap persisted. The relationship between the anomalous underground chambers and the souterrain category is worth examining in more detail than it usually receives, because the souterrain category has functioned as a kind of intellectual catch basin into which anomalous material has been poured for more than a century without the material necessarily fitting. The accepted understanding of souterrains in Scottish archaeology is that they are semi-subterranean, stone-lined passages and chambers associated with Iron Age settlements, primarily from the period approximately 200 BCE to 400 CE, and that their primary function was the cool, stable storage of perishable foods. This understanding is based on excavated examples that are associated with identifiable Iron Age settlements that contain artifact assemblages consistent with domestic use and food preparation, and that are constructed in a style consistent with the broader Iron Age masonry tradition. The understanding is well supported for the category it describes. The problem is that the souterrain label has been applied to a much broader range of underground features than the evidence supports. Features that lack the associated settlement evidence, features that are too large for the souterrain dimensional range, features that are constructed in techniques inconsistent with Iron Age masonry as evidenced at the well-dated examples, and features whose geographic and geological contexts are anomalous for the souterrain distribution, have all been labelled souterrain in various reports and databases. The labelling is sometimes done deliberately, as a conservative choice in the face of uncertainty. If you don't know what something is, calling it a souterrain is less professionally risky than calling it anomalous and leaving the question open. The labelling is sometimes done through ignorance of the detailed souterrain literature, and sometimes it is done correctly, because the feature actually is a souterrain. The problem is that once the label is applied, the analytical process tends to stop. The feature is categorized. It goes into the database as a souterrain. Future researchers who consult the database see a souterrain and have no reason to look more closely. The anomalous characteristics that should have provoked further investigation are buried under the label. This is not a problem unique to Scottish archaeology. Categorization is a fundamental tool of knowledge management, and it is always a compromise between precision and efficiency. In most contexts, the efficiency gain from categorization is worth the precision loss, because the categories are adequate to the material and the edge cases are rare enough not to distort the picture significantly. In the Scottish underground chamber case, the edge cases may not be rare. If a significant proportion of what the database categories as souterrain is in fact something else, or something for which the souterrain category is only partially appropriate, then the database is giving a misleading picture of what was built underground in Scotland, and research programs built on the database are working with a distorted foundation. Assessing the scale of this problem would require a systematic re-examination of the souterrain database against the original discovery reports and physical evidence. For the features where physical evidence is still accessible, this has not been done. It is the kind of work that does not fit neatly into a single research project because it is primarily critical and corrective rather than generative. It does not promise to find new things. It promises to reveal that some of what was classified as known is not actually known. That is important work, but it is not the kind of work that attracts funding or generates publications in high-impact venues. The landscape of the Scottish borders represents a distinct zone in the underground chamber record that deserves focused attention. The borders, the country between the Cheviots and the southern uplands, and running roughly from Dumfries and Galloway in the west to Berwickshire in the east, was a zone of intensive agricultural use and modification from at least the medieval period, and the drainage campaigns of the 18th and 19th century improvement movement hit this area particularly hard. The soil types in much of the borders are responsive to drainage improvement in ways that made the investment economically worthwhile, and the estate records of the borders improvement period are consequently more detailed and more numerous than in many other parts of Scotland. This means that underground discoveries during drainage work in the borders are better documented than discoveries in less economically active areas. The documentation is in private estate archives that have been deposited in varying degrees with public repositories, primarily the National Records of Scotland and the regional archives of the border councils. Some of this material has been surveyed by local historians. Much of it has not been systematically examined for underground discovery reports. The borders discoveries from the improvement period include several cases that sit outside the Souterrain range in the same ways that the Angus cases do: dimensions, construction quality, isolation from surface settlement evidence, and sealed entry conditions. The border geology adds a dimension not present in the harder rock of the highlands and islands. The borders sits on a variety of substrates, including old red sandstone, carboniferous limestone in some areas, and the Silurian mudstones and greywacke that form much of the southern upland structural core. The presence of limestone means that some underground spaces in the borders are natural karst features, which complicates interpretation because distinguishing natural void from modified void requires physical examination. Some of the 19th century borders discovery reports clearly describe natural caves or rock shelters, and these are not relevant to the construction question. But some describe spaces in lithologies that do not produce natural voids easily, and in these cases the construction inference is more straightforward. One particularly interesting cluster of reports from the borders concerns an area in Roxburghshire, in the valley of one of the Teviot's tributaries, where 3 separate drainage incidents between 1847 and 1869 broke into underground spaces that were described in sufficiently consistent terms to suggest they may have been parts of a connected system. Each of the 3 incidents produced a report, 2 in estate accounts, 1 in a letter from the supervising engineer to the estate owner that is preserved in a collection now held by the National Records of Scotland. The spaces described in the 3 reports share the characteristics of dry stone construction, level floors, and narrow entries, and the reports note in 2 cases that the space extended beyond the point where investigation was possible. The 1869 report from the supervising engineer is the most detailed. The engineer, who appears to have had some experience with the type of feature from earlier work elsewhere in the borders, describes the space he encountered as being of a scale that he characterized as domestic, roughly meaning large enough to house people comfortably, though he was clear this was not his interpretation of its original function. He noted that the stone had been dressed on the interior surfaces to a smoothness he considered consistent with considerable use rather than merely with construction. He measured the portion accessible to him as approximately 18 feet in length and 8 feet in width, with a ceiling height he estimated at between 7 and 8 feet at the apex. He noted traces of soot on the ceiling at one point, consistent with the use of an open flame over an extended period. He did not find artifacts in the accessible portion. He sealed the entry for safety and completed the drainage installation. Whether the 3 Roxburghshire features from 1847, 1855 and 1869 are parts of a single connected system or 3 independent constructions is unknown. Their locations within the valley are consistent with a connected system given typical underground passage configurations, but without excavation and survey the connection cannot be established or refuted. The locations are approximately known from the estate records, though land boundary changes in the intervening century and a half have complicated precise identification. It is one of those cases where the information necessary to locate and investigate the features exists in principle, but would require a specific archival research effort to compile, followed by field survey to confirm, followed by whatever investigation was appropriate given the findings of the survey. The effort has not been made. The question of what the chambers were for is the question that the chambers themselves cannot directly answer, and it is the question that the researchers who take this material seriously find most persistently difficult. The honest position is that the function of anomalous chambers is unknown, and that the range of possible functions is too wide to narrow without evidence that does not currently exist. Storage is possible. It is the least dramatic explanation and the one most compatible with the existing framework. But the chambers that are too large for any plausible storage function, or that are isolated from any identifiable population center that would have needed the storage, or that have features inconsistent with storage use, those chambers require a different explanation. The alternatives are not dramatic by necessity, but they are harder to fit into a simple framework. Ritual use is consistent with the evidence in some cases and is not consistent in others. Industrial use, specifically the production of materials or objects requiring controlled temperature or humidity, is possible but requires specific supporting evidence that has not been documented. Habitation is consistent in terms of size and construction quality for several of the larger chambers, but the evidence for sustained habitation use, as distinct from temporary shelter use, is thin in most cases. Political or administrative function, a meeting place, a place of judgment, a place of storage for records or objects of communal significance, is possible, but requires a level of organizational complexity that the existing framework is not always ready to attribute to the periods and cultures in question. The reluctance to attribute organizational complexity is itself worth examining because it is not simply a conservative application of the evidence. It is a product of a long-standing assumption in Western archaeological interpretation that the further back you go, the simpler the social organization. This assumption has been challenged and revised repeatedly by specific discoveries and by the theoretical development of the field, but it persists in practice even where it has been abandoned in principle. Neolithic Orkney, which we already discussed, is the clearest Scottish example of a case where the evidence forced an upward revision of the estimated organizational complexity of a prehistoric population. The scale of the Ness of Brodgar, the precision of Maeshoe's alignment, the coordination required to transport and erect the megaliths of the Ring of Brodgar, these cannot be products of a social organization as simple as the model that prevailed before excavation began at these sites. The model was wrong. The physical evidence forced the revision. But the model revised only for the period and type of evidence that forced it. The same revision has not been applied across the board to other evidence types and periods in Scotland, including the underground chamber record, where the assumption of simplicity continues to influence interpretation and to make anomalous evidence seem anomalous when it might simply be evidence of a complexity that the model has not yet been forced to accommodate. The comparison to Göbekli Tepe, the site in what is now southeastern Turkey, where a complex of monumental stone enclosures from approximately 12,000 years ago was excavated beginning in the 1990s, is relevant here because Göbekli Tepe is the clearest recent example of a physical discovery, forcing a fundamental revision of archaeological assumptions about organizational complexity at a given period. Before Göbekli Tepe, the consensus was that the organizational capacity required for monumental stone construction did not exist before the development of agriculture and settled communities. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture. Its builders were, by the best current evidence, hunter-gatherers. The discovery did not simply add a data point. It required a reconceptualization of the relationship between organizational complexity and subsistence strategy that is still working itself out in the field. If hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago in Anatolia could coordinate the construction of a monumental stone complex of the scale and sophistication of Göbekli Tepe, then assumptions about what was possible in prehistoric Scotland in terms of underground construction need to be held considerably more lightly than the existing framework implies. This is not an argument that Scotland's underground chambers are as old as Göbekli Tepe. They almost certainly are not. But it is an argument that the range of organizational complexity available to prehistoric Scottish populations at any given period is wider than the default assumptions acknowledge, and that discoveries inconsistent with those defaults should be investigated rather than assimilated without scrutiny. The specific question of pre-Neolithic occupation of Scotland is relevant here because the question of underground construction before the Neolithic is not closed. Scotland was inhabitable before the Neolithic in the areas south of the ice sheet margin during warmer phases of the Pleistocene, and Mesolithic occupation of Scotland from approximately 10,000 years ago is documented by a growing body of evidence. The Mesolithic site at Howick in Northumberland, which is technically just south of the Scottish border, documented a Mesolithic structure with substantial post holes, suggesting a more permanent or repeatedly occupied shelter than the casual camp model of Mesolithic life implied. Mesolithic sites in Scotland include Kinloch on the Isle of Rum, where excavation has documented occupation from approximately 8,500 years ago, and several other coastal and inland sites. The question of whether Mesolithic populations in Scotland used or constructed underground spaces is essentially unaddressed, because the search for underground features at Mesolithic sites has not been a priority. The prior assumption that Mesolithic people did not construct substantial underground features has not been tested against the physical evidence of Scottish Mesolithic sites in any systematic way. If any portion of Scotland's anomalous underground chambers dates to the Mesolithic, which is a possibility that cannot be ruled out and has not been seriously tested, that would represent a fundamental revision of the known history of underground construction in Britain. It would also help explain a specific feature of some of the anomalous chamber accounts that has not been adequately explained by any post-Mesolithic construction hypothesis. The apparent antiquity of the stonework patina noted by several researchers, which, in some accounts, is described as consistent with dates considerably older than any construction period, the researchers were prepared to suggest explicitly. The reluctance to suggest Mesolithic dates is understandable, because without supporting evidence, the claim is too extraordinary for the conventional literature. But the reluctance to investigate whether the stonework could be Mesolithic, in cases where the evidence is at least consistent with that possibility, is a different matter. Investigation is possible. It simply has not been prioritized. Let's talk about the specific issue of stone selection in the anomalous chambers, because it is one of the more technically interesting and consistently underappreciated aspects of the documentary record. In several of the most detailed accounts of anomalous underground chambers in Scotland, the stonework is described in terms that include observations about the material selected. The characterization of the stone as inconsistent with the local surface geology is not an exotic observation. It is a straightforward factual note. The surface geology of the site is of one type. The stone used in the chamber walls is of a different type. The implication is that the stone was quarried or collected elsewhere and transported to the construction site, which is a straightforward inference from the mismatch. What the reporters rarely do is pursue the obvious follow-up question, which is where the stone came from and what that implies about the social organization and geographical reach of the builders. In the Scottish Neolithic context, the transport of non-local stone to monument construction sites is well documented. The blue stones at Stonehenge came from Wales, a transport of hundreds of miles that has been confirmed by geological sourcing. In Orkney, some of the stone used in construction came from outcrops that were not immediately local to the building sites. The transport of stone in Neolithic Britain was not unusual. It was a characteristic feature of the monumental construction tradition. If anomalous underground chambers in Scotland also used non-local stone, that characteristic links them to the same tradition of organized large-scale construction. It is a data point with implications for the period, the culture, and the social organization of the builders. Pursuing the geology of the stone in the documented anomalous chambers would in principle be straightforward. Samples from the surviving accessible portions of these chambers could be analysed and compared against the Scottish geological record to identify source areas. This has not been done systematically. In some cases, it has been done informally by geologists who noted the discrepancy in passing without pursuing it further. The informal observations are in the record, but have not been compiled or analysed as a dataset. The question of entry configuration in the anomalous chambers deserves attention as a specific technical feature. Entry passages in the documented chambers are consistently described as narrow, meaning narrow relative to the interior dimensions of the chamber they give access to. This narrowing of the entry is characteristic of chambered cairns in the Neolithic tradition, where the entry passage is markedly smaller in cross-section than the internal chamber or chambers. The function of this narrowing in the chambered cairn tradition has been interpreted variously, as a defensive feature, as a way of controlling light entry, as a symbolic threshold marking the transition between the outside and inside worlds, and as a practical feature related to the temperature and humidity control of the interior. In the anomalous underground chamber context, the narrow entry configuration is noted in the historical accounts without being interpreted, because the reporters were not working within a framework that gave them interpretive tools for this feature. The consistency of the narrow entry across the anomalous chamber reports is itself interesting because it suggests the feature was designed rather than accidental. Underground spaces with narrow entries and large interiors are not the result of random excavation. They are the result of a specific constructional intention. The orientation of underground chambers is another feature that the historical accounts occasionally note but rarely pursue. Orientation in prehistoric architecture is significant in multiple contexts. Chambered cairns have documented orientation patterns relative to solar events. Stone circle alignments to astronomical events have been the subject of extensive research. The question of whether anomalous underground chambers show consistent orientation patterns has not been addressed because the data to address it has not been compiled. The individual accounts sometimes note the orientation of entry passages or the long axis of the chamber relative to compass bearing or relative to local topographic features. If these individual notes were compiled across the full dataset of documented chambers, it would be possible to test for orientation patterns. If such patterns exist, they would be significant evidence of a shared design tradition, which would in turn be evidence of cultural connection between the builders of different chambers at different locations and potentially different times. The compilation of the data is the prerequisite to the analysis, and the compilation has not been done. Scotland's relationship to water, as a landscape fact, is inseparable from the story of its underground spaces. Scotland receives extraordinarily high precipitation in its western regions, with annual rainfall totals in some areas of the Western Highlands and Islands exceeding 3,000 millimetres. This is not a dry climate. The management of water, above and below ground, has been a constant practical concern for any population living in Scotland, and the evidence of water management in Scottish prehistory is substantial. The field drainage systems, the clearance cairns representing land management effort, the construction of storage and shelter against the wet, all of these reflect a sustained response to the moisture of the Scottish landscape. Underground chambers in this context serve functions that a dry climate would not require in the same form. The stable temperature and humidity of a well-constructed underground space in a wet climate represents a resource with practical value for food storage, for craft production requiring controlled conditions, and for any activity where the surface environment's variability is a problem. The chambers were not built by people who ignored their environment. They were built by people who understood it well enough to construct solutions to its specific challenges. The connection between underground chamber construction and water management, more broadly, is suggested by several of the historical accounts in which chamber discovery occurred during drainage work. The drainage campaigns of the improvement period were not simply removing excess water from agricultural land. They were, in many instances, modifying the hydrology of landscapes that had been managed by traditional drainage systems whose design and maintenance stretched back for generations. When the improvement drainage cut through traditional drainage features, it sometimes broke into underground spaces that were part of the older hydrology management system. This is a plausible interpretation for some of the anomalous chamber discoveries. The chambers were not separate constructions with separate purposes, but elements of a more complex infrastructure whose above-ground components had been removed or obscured by subsequent land use while the underground components survived. An underground chamber positioned adjacent to a spring, with a dry interior maintained by drainage features built into its construction, functions as a node in a water management network. Its existence reflects landscape engineering at a scale that requires sustained organizational capacity to plan and execute. This infrastructural interpretation of anomalous underground chambers is not widely discussed in the literature, primarily because it requires thinking about prehistoric Scotland in terms of engineered landscapes rather than isolated monuments. The monument model is deeply embedded in how British prehistory has been conceptualized. Monuments are discrete, visible, and amenable to the kind of excavation and analysis that produces clear results. Engineered landscapes are diffuse, often invisible from the surface, and require a different kind of investigative approach, one that integrates above-ground and below-ground evidence across larger areas, and that is sensitive to the logic of hydrology and land use, rather than simply to the characteristics of individual structures. The transition toward thinking about prehistoric landscapes as managed and engineered, rather than simply inhabited, is happening in British and Irish archaeology generally, driven by LiDAR survey data and large-scale geophysical survey programs that reveal patterns invisible from the ground. Scotland has participated in this transition at specific high-profile sites. The extension of the infrastructural thinking to the anomalous underground chamber record has not yet been systematically attempted. There is a broader question that the Scottish underground chamber record raises, but rarely articulates explicitly, which is the question of what counts as evidence in the debate about prehistoric capability. The standard of evidence in archaeology is, appropriately, high. The field has learned from the mistakes of earlier generations who attributed prehistoric achievements to lost civilizations, alien contact, or other frameworks that removed agency from the actual human populations of the past. The reaction against these mistakes, which is entirely justified, has produced a culture of caution that sometimes becomes a culture of dismissal. The difference between the two is significant. Caution says, this evidence is not conclusive, further investigation is required, provisional conclusions are possible within specified limits. Dismissal says, this evidence does not fit the accepted framework and is therefore either wrong or irrelevant. Caution is good science, dismissal is not. In the Scottish underground chamber case, the pattern of response to anomalous evidence has been closer to dismissal than to caution, and the result has been the loss of opportunities for investigation that would have either confirmed the anomalous character of the evidence or resolved it within the existing framework. The researchers who have raised these questions over the decades were not, in the majority of cases, arguing for lost civilizations or extraordinary origins. They were arguing for more careful attention to evidence that did not fit the standard categories, for investigation rather than dismissal, for the kind of methodological humility that acknowledges the limits of the existing framework when confronted with evidence outside those limits. These are not radical positions. They are the normal operations of scientific progress. That they have been consistently treated as marginal or disreputable in the Scottish underground chamber context is itself a fact that needs explaining, and the explanation is institutional and social rather than scientific. The science does not require dismissal. The institutional dynamics do. Let's consider what has been found in the last 20 years specifically, because the recent period has produced new data that is not always connected to the older anomalous chamber discussion. The development of Scotland's infrastructure in the early 21st century, specifically the construction of road improvements, utility upgrades, wind farm access tracks, and the various projects associated with the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure in the Scottish landscape, has produced discovery contexts comparable to the drainage campaigns of the 19th century. Development-led archaeology, which is the practice of conducting archaeological investigation as a condition of planning permission for development projects, has become standard in Scotland under the planning regulations implemented from the 1990s onward. This means that when a major infrastructure project breaks ground, there is an archaeological watching brief in place, and any discoveries trigger a recording and assessment process that was entirely absent during the drainage campaign period. The results of development-led archaeology in Scotland over the last 20 years are substantial. Many previously unknown sites have been documented. The Canmore database has been significantly expanded by development-led findings, but the anomalous underground chamber material in this recent data is not well flagged as such, for reasons that are by now familiar. The assessment process that governs development-led archaeology is designed to identify and protect known site types. Anomalous features, features that do not fit known categories, are assessed against the known categories and categorized as best as possible within them. The pressure of the development schedule is real. An archaeological assessment that delays a major infrastructure project has significant economic consequences, and the incentive to categorize and clear a feature rather than raise complex interpretive questions is substantial. Development-led archaeology produces a great deal of valuable data, but it is not ideally structured for the investigation of anomalous evidence, and the anomalous underground chamber material that has turned up in recent development contexts has been processed in ways that tend to minimize rather than foreground its anomalous characteristics. Wind farm development in the Scottish Highlands and Islands has been one of the most significant drivers of development-led archaeology in the last 2 decades. Because wind farm sites are frequently in areas of Scotland that have been archaeologically under-investigated, and where the geophysical and watching brief work required for planning compliance is producing first data from areas with no prior systematic survey. Some of this data is feeding into understanding of the prehistoric landscape in ways that are significant. The anomalous underground features documented during wind farm watching briefs in the Northern Highlands and Islands include several cases that are described in the Grey literature reports, The unpublished assessment reports submitted to the planning authorities, in terms that suggest they are not easily categorized within the standard frameworks. Grey literature is not peer-reviewed and is not always publicly accessible, but it is required to be submitted to the relevant regional and national heritage bodies and is in principle available for consultation. Compiling the grey literature reports relevant to underground features across the last 2 decades of Scottish development archaeology would be a substantial task, but it would produce a dataset that is more current and in some respects better documented than anything the 19th century material offers. The challenge of the grey literature is part of a broader issue with how archaeological knowledge is stored and shared in Scotland. The formal academic publication pipeline is slow and selective. Significant findings can take years to appear in the peer-reviewed literature, and findings that are anomalous or uncertain may never appear there. The grey literature is more comprehensive, but is not consistently indexed or cross-referenced. The Canmore database, which RCAHMS and now Historic Environment Scotland maintain, is the most systematic, publicly accessible aggregation of Scottish archaeological knowledge, but it reflects what has been formally reported to it, which is not everything that has been found. The result is a situation where the total knowledge base about Scottish archaeology is distributed across multiple systems with different access rules and different levels of completeness, and where no single researcher has a comprehensive picture of what is known. This fragmentation of knowledge is not specific to Scotland, and it is not specific to the underground chamber question. It is a systemic feature of archaeological knowledge management globally, being addressed in varying ways by digitization initiatives, open data policies, and the development of more integrated database infrastructure. In the Scottish context, the Historic Environment Scotland commitment to digital access has improved the situation considerably in the last decade, and the accessibility of the Canmore database in particular is substantially better than it was. But the anomalous material, the material that was never formally reported or that was reported in ways that obscured its anomalous character, is not in Canmore. It is in the places described earlier: private archives, university collections, unpublished typescripts, grey literature that has not been systematically reviewed for this material oral tradition. Accessing it requires a specific research intention and a willingness to work outside the standard database infrastructure. The effort is possible. It is not currently being made in any organized way. One more aspect of this story deserves to be told carefully, because it involves a community whose relationship to the underground landscape of Scotland is both the most direct and the least formally recognized. The traveller communities of Scotland, who have maintained a mobile way of life across the Scottish landscape for a period that is longer than is often acknowledged, have a relationship to the underground geography of Scotland that is practical and experiential. Traveller communities in Scotland have historically used a range of landscape features for shelter and storage, including caves, rock shelters, and in some documented cases, constructed underground spaces. The knowledge of these features was passed through community networks in the same way that knowledge of water sources, shelter locations, and grazing grounds was passed, as practical landscape knowledge essential for survival. This community knowledge is not reflected in the formal archaeological record because traveller communities were not the population whose knowledge the formal record was designed to capture. But the knowledge is there, or was there, in living memory among elders who knew the landscape from a way of moving through it that the farming and settled communities did not share. The traveller relationship to underground space in Scotland is connected to, but distinct from, the broader oral tradition question discussed earlier. Traveller knowledge of the landscape is practical and precise in a way that generalised oral tradition is not always. The location of a specific shelter, that a specific route between seasonal stopping places passed by, the characteristics of a space that made it usable, or not, for a specific purpose, the history of a particular feature as known to the community. This kind of knowledge is geographically anchored and practically tested in ways that make it a potential resource for locating features that are not in the formal record. The challenge is accessing that knowledge in ways that are respectful of the communities who hold it and that produce information usable for investigative purposes. It requires the kind of engagement that begins with trust, which begins with a sustained relationship rather than a one-time inquiry, and which requires the researchers involved to approach community knowledge as a legitimate form of expertise rather than as anecdote requiring verification. This approach is not impossible. It has been developed in other contexts in Scotland and elsewhere. It has not been applied to the underground chamber question. The cumulative picture assembled from these various threads, the archival record, the development-led archaeology, the geological context, the construction technique evidence, the oral traditions, the community knowledge, the comparative analysis against known monument types, and the consistent pattern of inadequate institutional response is not a picture of a solved mystery with the solution filed in an inconvenient drawer. It is a picture of a genuine and unresolved set of questions about what was built beneath Scotland and by whom and for what purpose, questions that cannot be answered with the evidence currently assembled and analysed, but that are not unanswerable in principle. The evidence required to make progress on these questions exists in the ground, in the archives, and in the living knowledge of communities. Accessing and analysing that evidence would require a research programme of the scale and duration that Scottish prehistoric archaeology has successfully organised for other questions. It is a question of priority, which is a question of value, which is ultimately a question about what the past is for and whose past it is. The past in Scotland is contested in specific and important ways. The legacy of the Highland clearances and the plantation of Ulster, the destruction of Gaelic culture through sustained legal and economic pressure from the 18th century onward, the erasure of traveller community histories, the marginalisation of indigenous knowledge systems. These are not ancient grievances. They are recent enough to be within living memory in some cases and within grandparental memory in most. The relationship between this history and the underground chamber question is not direct, but it is not irrelevant. The communities whose landscape knowledge was most likely to include precise information about underground features are the communities whose knowledge systems were most systematically marginalized in the period when the formal archaeological record was being established. The result is not only a moral injustice, which it is, but an informational gap in the knowledge base of Scottish archaeology that cannot be filled from the formal record because the formal record was not built to capture what those communities knew. This informational gap has practical consequences for the investigation of anomalous underground chambers. The formal record tells you that certain features were discovered at certain locations at certain dates and were described in certain ways. It does not tell you whether those features were known to local communities before their formal discovery, which in many cases they were, as the 1,829 Perthshire estate accounts reference to the Gaelic local name makes explicit. It does not tell you whether there are associated features not included in the discovery account because the reporter did not know to ask. It does not tell you whether the oral traditions of the local community contained information about the feature's original function or period that might have constrained interpretation. In the cases where the local name for a feature is preserved in the formal record, the name is sometimes translatable in ways that are informative. References to the old ones, to the hidden ones, to the house of the ancestors, suggest community knowledge that the chamber predated any living memory and was attributed to populations earlier than the communities who maintained knowledge of it. These translated names are data, imperfect, and requiring careful interpretation, but data nonetheless. The question of ancestral attribution in the oral traditions is interesting because it introduces a dimension of time depth that is not always acknowledged. When a community consistently attributes a feature to a population prior to themselves, they are making a historical claim that is worth taking seriously in the same way that any historical claim is worth taking seriously, which means neither accepting it uncritically nor dismissing it because it does not come in written form. The attribution to earlier populations in the Scottish oral traditions is consistent enough across geographically separated communities that it suggests something more than local legend. Communities in Lewis, in Caithness, in Perthshire, in Roxburghshire, who had no formal contact with each other, described the underground features of their respective landscapes in terms that attributed them to earlier inhabitants. This consistency is evidence of something, even if what it is evidence of requires careful analysis to determine. The parallel with Australian Aboriginal oral tradition is instructive here, though it should not be pressed too far given the very different historical contexts. In the Australian case, the research by geologist Patrick Nunn and others has documented multiple instances where Aboriginal oral traditions contain accurate information about geological events, specifically sea level changes at the end of the last glacial maximum more than 10,000 years ago, that has been confirmed by independent geological evidence. The traditions describe the flooding of areas that are now underwater, the formation of specific geographic features, and other geological events that occurred long before any written record, and that could not have been preserved accurately in memory without either extraordinary cognitive traditions or continuous preservation of the information over many generations. The implication is that human oral traditions can preserve accurate information about landscape history over time periods that most Western academic frameworks have been reluctant to accept as possible. If this is true for geological events, it may also be true for anthropogenic features, for things that were built and used and then abandoned, whose locations and general characteristics were maintained in community memory across the generations that followed. The Western academic framework for oral tradition reliability is changing, driven by exactly this kind of evidence. The conservative position that oral traditions are unreliable beyond a few generations is being revised in light of cases where the traditions have demonstrably preserved accurate information over much longer periods. The mechanisms of reliable oral tradition are not simply undifferentiated community memory. They involve specialized knowledge-keeping roles, systematic methods for ensuring accuracy, and the embedding of information in narrative and ceremonial forms that provide redundancy and resist distortion. Scottish Highland and Island communities had sophisticated knowledge-keeping traditions, some aspects of which are documented even through the period of cultural suppression. The degree to which these traditions preserved information about the underground landscape is a question that has not been systematically investigated. It is another of the potential data sources that sits unused. Now let us look at the specific case of what has been called, in the limited literature that takes it seriously, the network hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that some proportion of Scotland's anomalous underground chambers are not isolated features, but elements of an interconnected system, designed and built as a network, rather than as individual structures. The network hypothesis is suggested by several features of the documented cases. The passages that extend beyond the point of investigation in many accounts could, if they were followed, connect to other chambers or to the surface at locations not yet identified. The orientation patterns noted for some chambers are consistent with a planned layout rather than opportunistic construction. The spacing of known anomalous chamber locations in some areas is consistent with a network logic, where the distances between features correspond to travel times or other organizing principles rather than being random. And the oral traditions in some areas describe underground passages connecting specific locations, a type of claim that is usually classified as folk legend, but which, in several documented cases, has corresponded to actual physical connections when the passages were investigated. The network hypothesis is not provable from the available evidence. It is a hypothesis, and distinguishing it from the simpler hypothesis that the chambers are isolated individual constructions of varying dates and purposes requires exactly the kind of systematic investigation that has not been done. But it is a coherent and testable hypothesis, and its testability is itself significant. A hypothesis that can be tested is a hypothesis that science can engage with. The question of whether Scotland's anomalous underground chambers form a network is answerable in principle. Compile the known locations, conduct geophysical survey to identify connecting features between them, and excavate where the results are ambiguous. The conclusion could be that the network hypothesis is wrong, that the chambers are isolated, and that would itself be a contribution to knowledge. The alternative, that there are connections, would be more remarkable but would at least be based on evidence rather than inference. The parallel to Roman infrastructure is worth using carefully here. The Romans built extensive underground infrastructure in Britain, including culverts, drains, and in some cities underground passages for utility purposes. Roman underground construction in Britain is well documented and archaeologically attested at numerous sites. The point of the parallel is not to suggest that Scotland's anomalous chambers are Roman, which the evidence does not support, but to establish that the concept of planned underground infrastructure in prehistoric and historic Britain is not exotic. It is documented. The Romans did it. The question is whether other populations at earlier periods also did it, not necessarily in the same form or for the same purposes, but with the same fundamental understanding that underground space can be planned and constructed as infrastructure rather than simply used opportunistically. The Bronze Age in Scotland, approximately 2200 to 700 BCE, is a period that is archaeologically present but unevenly understood. The Bronze Age left a legacy of round cairns, standing stones, rock art, and metalwork that are documented across the landscape. What Bronze Age communities did underground is less clearly established. The transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age in Scotland involved the population replacement noted earlier, and the incoming Bronze Age population brought cultural practices different from the Neolithic in important ways. Round cairns replaced the communal long cairns of the Neolithic. The monumental construction tradition changed character. Whether the underground construction tradition continued, adapted, or was abandoned is not known, because the evidence to decide has not been assembled. Some of the anomalous chambers, on the basis of associated finds where they exist, and on the basis of constructional similarities to dated Bronze Age features in Ireland and Wales, may date to the Bronze Age. Some may date to the Neolithic. Some may be Iron Age or later, but built in a style that reflects continuity with earlier traditions. The dating question is fundamental and is currently unanswerable without the physical evidence. Ireland is a useful reference point because Irish underground archaeology, while facing many of the same institutional challenges as the Scottish material, is somewhat better documented in a few specific respects. Ireland has a larger body of excavated and published material on underground chambers than Scotland, partly because the pace of development-led archaeology in Ireland has been very high in the last 3 decades, and partly because Irish prehistoric archaeology has been actively pursued in the post-independence period as a component of national cultural identity in ways that generated institutional support for field research. The Souterrain tradition in Ireland is documented with more precision than in Scotland, and the identification of anomalous features that go beyond the Souterrain category has been possible against a more complete baseline. Some Irish underground features have been dated by radiocarbon to periods and contexts that are unexpected, and the Irish material represents a resource that Scottish researchers working on the anomalous chamber question should be actively drawing on. The two traditions, Irish and Scottish, are culturally connected across the entire period in question, and discoveries in one context have direct implications for the interpretation of material in the other. This cross-reference is not systematic in the existing literature. Wales also has an underground chamber tradition that is documented in ways relevant to the Scottish discussion. The Welsh material, primarily from the prehistoric period, includes features that have been investigated more thoroughly than the Scottish anomalous chambers in several cases, partly because of the dense archaeological landscape of Wales and the sustained research attention it has received. The dolmenic tradition in Wales, the portal dolmens and passage tombs whose above-ground components are among the most dramatic prehistoric monuments in Britain, has obvious below-ground dimensions that connect to the underground chamber question in the same way that the Scottish chambered cairns do. Whether the Welsh underground record contains anomalous chambers in the same sense as the Scottish record is a question that would require the same kind of archival and field investigation to answer, but the Welsh material is worth knowing as a comparative dataset when approaching the Scottish question. The Isle of Man sits at an intersection of Scottish, Irish, and Welsh cultural influences across the prehistoric and early historic periods, and has its own underground chamber record that is worth including in the regional picture. The Manx evidence is relatively small in absolute terms, but includes several documented cases of underground features that have been inadequately investigated and that share characteristics with the anomalous Scottish material. The Manx oral traditions, preserved in Manx Gaelic sources, also contain references to underground spaces and passages that have not been systematically analysed in relation to the physical evidence. The Isle of Man is small enough that a comprehensive survey of its underground chamber record would be a manageable research project, and the Manx evidence, properly documented and analysed, could serve as a model for the more complex Scottish investigation. The Faroe Islands and Shetland represent the northern extension of this Atlantic island chain, and both have underground features documented in the archaeological literature. Shetland's prehistoric underground structures include features beyond the standard Souterrain range that have been noted in regional surveys without being fully investigated. The Faroese material is less well documented from an English language archaeological perspective, but contains features noted by Scandinavian researchers that are relevant to the construction tradition question. The Atlantic island arc from Scotland through the Faroe Islands and Shetland to Iceland was a corridor of human movement and cultural exchange across multiple prehistoric periods, and the underground chamber tradition, if it is a tradition, may have a distribution that follows this corridor in ways that current research has not mapped. There is a specific technical issue in the dating of underground chambers that is worth explaining carefully, because it has produced some of the most frustrating results in the documented investigation attempts, and because it is central to understanding why the dating question remains so difficult. Radiocarbon dating requires organic material, specifically carbon-containing material that was once living, in order to produce a date for the deposit containing that material. The date produced is the date of the organism's death, not the date of the deposit's formation, which means that the relationship between the dated material and the construction event being sought must be established by stratigraphic analysis rather than by the dating itself. In an underground chamber, the organic material available for dating is typically charcoal from a hearth, animal bone from occupation deposits, or plant material from specific contexts within the fill sequence. Each of these comes with interpretive challenges. Charcoal from a hearth deposits inside a chamber dates the hearth use, not the chamber construction. If the chamber was built in period X and the hearth was used in period Y, the charcoal gives you period Y. This is useful if you want to know when the chamber was last used for that activity, but it tells you nothing about when the chamber was built. If period Y is already known from surface evidence, the dating adds nothing to the underground question. If period Y is unexpected, the dating creates a puzzle rather than solving one. Animal bone dates the death of the animal, which may be contemporary with the deposit or may be residual from an earlier phase. Plant material can be highly accurate if the deposit containing it is clearly sealed and primary, but underground deposits are frequently disturbed by later use, water action, and bioturbation in ways that introduce material from multiple periods into a single apparent stratigraphic context. The result of radiocarbon dating in underground chamber contexts is frequently a set of dates from a range of periods that cannot be unambiguously sequenced into a construction history. This is not a criticism of the technique. It is a description of the challenge of applying the technique in a context that was not static and whose depositional history was complex. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, which measures the time since quartz or feldspar grains in a sediment were last exposed to light, offers a potential route around some of the radiocarbon challenges in underground contexts. If the fill sequence in an underground chamber can be sampled at appropriate depths, and the samples show consistent stratigraphic relationships with the chamber's constructional elements, OSL dating can, in principle, give dates for the accumulation of specific sediment layers that are independent of the organic material problems of radiocarbon. The technique has been applied at a small number of Scottish prehistoric sites with success. Its application to underground chamber contexts in Scotland has been limited, partly because access to appropriate chambers for sampling has been difficult, and partly because the technique is more expensive than standard radiocarbon dating and requires specialist facilities not widely available. But it is a viable approach that a properly funded project could deploy, and the data it could produce would substantially advance the dating question. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, is not directly applicable to stone-built underground chambers, but it has potential relevance in the small number of documented cases where wooden structural elements have been found associated with underground features. Wooden posts, lintels, or other structural timber preserved in the anaerobic conditions of a sealed underground deposit could in principle be dated by tree ring matching against the reference chronologies available for Scottish timber. The survival of timber in underground contexts in Scotland is highly variable and generally poor, because the Scottish climate creates conditions that degrade organic material relatively quickly once seal is broken. But the cases where timber survival has been reported deserve specific investigation for dendrochronology potential, because a single well-preserved timber in the right context could provide a precise calendar date that no other technique currently offers. Ground-penetrating radar, which has been mentioned several times, is not a dating tool but a location and mapping tool. Its role in the underground chamber investigation would be to identify the existence and extent of features before excavation, allowing excavation to be targeted rather than exploratory. The precision of GPR mapping has improved substantially in the last decade, and the current generation of equipment can resolve features at depths and in substrates that were beyond reach in the early applications. The combination of GPR survey to locate and map features, OSL dating to establish sediment chronologies where radiocarbon is inadequate, and targeted excavation of specific contexts identified by the survey and dating work would constitute a methodologically sophisticated program that could address the most important outstanding questions about specific chambers within a realistic timeframe and budget. This is not a description of an impossible research agenda. It is a description of what a serious research program would look like. The cost of such a program would be substantial, but not extraordinary by the standards of major Scottish archaeological projects. The Ness of Brodgar project has operated at a scale comparable to what would be required for a systematic underground chamber investigation and has attracted funding from a combination of public grants, charitable trusts, and public donations. The anomalous underground chamber investigation would need a similar funding mix and would face a similar challenge in making the case for investment to bodies whose assessment criteria were not designed with this kind of problem in mind. The case would need to be made not in terms of spectacular expected discoveries, which cannot be promised, but in terms of the genuine uncertainty that the investigation would address and the genuine value of reducing that uncertainty. The argument is that not knowing what was built beneath Scotland is a gap in the knowledge of Scottish and British prehistory that has practical implications for how that history is told, taught, preserved, and used. Filling that gap, even partially, is worth the investment. There is a practical question about preservation conditions in the chambers that are still accessible, and it is a question that argues for urgency as well as for systematic investigation. The underground chambers whose existence is documented but whose condition is unknown are in variable states of preservation that are not stable. Human access, development pressures, changes in the water table, and the effects of climate change on the hydrological conditions of the areas where chambers are located are all factors that can alter preservation conditions over time. A chamber that was in good condition when it was last visited 20 or 30 years ago may be in worse condition today due to increased groundwater circulation, freeze-thaw effects in its structural elements, or the growth of root systems from surface vegetation. Waiting to investigate is not a neutral choice. It is a choice to lose more information with each passing year. The argument for urgency in the Scottish underground chamber case is not dramatic. It does not require postulating a countdown to catastrophic loss. It simply requires acknowledging that preservation conditions change, and that change is generally in the direction of loss rather than gain. The emotional dimension of this topic, which any honest account has to acknowledge, is the feeling that accompanies the awareness of how much has already been lost and how much more will be lost if the pattern continues. The chamber, documented by the supervising engineer in Roxburghshire in 1869, has not been scientifically investigated. It is somewhere under a borders field, in a condition unknown. The carved surface in the border rock shelter, documented in the 1960s, and then partially destroyed by dumped material, cannot be fully recovered. The 300-entry anomalous chamber dataset compiled over 2 decades by the researcher who retired before publishing it may or may not survive in usable form. The 1929 Angus complex, last definitively reported in 1934, is under a pipe route and has been partially destroyed. Each of these losses is irreversible. The information that was in those places is gone or degraded. That is simply true. It is not dramatic. It is the ordinary texture of what happens when things are not looked after. But it is not the whole picture. The whole picture also includes the chambers that are still there, in conditions that may be better than feared, in locations that can be identified from the archival record, waiting for the investigation that will finally come. The archive is still there. The oral traditions are still held. The geology is still mapped, and the substrate conditions are still favorable for preservation in many areas. The geophysical technology is available and improving. The researchers, even if not organized currently around this specific question, exist and could be organized. The regulatory framework, while imperfect for this purpose, provides a foundation for protection and investigation. The public interest is real, and represents a potential constituency for the funding and advocacy that a sustained investigation would require. None of the prerequisites are absent, they have simply not been assembled. The community of researchers who have contributed to the Scottish underground chamber literature over the last 200 years, from the antiquarians of the 19th century to the occasional academic publications of the 20th and early 21st centuries, is a dispersed and largely unconnected group. They did not know about each other in most cases. They were not working in a coordinated program. They were following specific threads of evidence that came their way through the accident of their location, their field, or their personal interest, and they left records that are now scattered across the archives of the institutions where they worked. Connecting those records, identifying the researchers and their contributions, and building them into a coherent intellectual history of the question would be a valuable preliminary to any field investigation. It would also be a contribution to the history of Scottish archaeology, in itself documenting the long succession of people who looked at the underground evidence and found it more complicated than the standard framework could accommodate. Among those researchers, some have passed away with significant knowledge unwritten. The researcher who compiled the 300-entry dataset did not publish the full work. The geologist who went into the Perthshire chamber in 1953 wrote one letter and then apparently said nothing more about it. The schoolmaster Mackintosh, who revisited the Angus complex in 1903 and wrote the most detailed account of the Corbelling, does not appear in the record again on this subject. These people had more knowledge than they left in the written record, for reasons that ranged from professional caution to the simple fact that no one asked them to write it down in a form designed to last. The lesson for the present is straightforward. The researchers who are currently working with anomalous underground evidence in Scotland, however few they are, should be encouraged to document their findings and reasoning in durable forms, even when the findings are ambiguous and the reasoning is tentative. Ambiguous findings documented carefully are more valuable than certain findings not documented at all. The popular interest in Scotland's underground mysteries is not going away, and it is not inherently a problem. The challenge is channeling it in directions that produce useful knowledge rather than reinforcing frameworks that are not supported by evidence. The popular literature on Scottish underground chambers ranges from responsible and evidence-based to reckless and imagination-driven, and the range is wide. The responsibility for the quality of the popular literature sits partly with the researchers who engage with it or who choose not to. When credentialed researchers withdraw from the popular conversation because the conversation has been contaminated by fringe claims, the consequence is that the fringe claims fill the vacuum. The alternative is engagement. Researchers who have legitimate findings and appropriate uncertainty, willing to participate in the public conversation, presenting evidence and reasoning in accessible form, distinguishing clearly between what is known and what is hypothesized, and helping the public navigate the genuine complexity of what the evidence does and does not show. This kind of public engagement is not always rewarded professionally, and that is a genuine structural problem in academic culture broadly. The time required to communicate responsibly with general audiences is time not spent on the publications and grant applications that determine academic career outcomes. Individual researchers who invest in public engagement do so at a personal cost that the institutional system does not compensate. Changing this requires institutional change that goes beyond any individual decision. But it is worth naming explicitly, because the absence of credentialed researchers from the public conversation about Scottish underground chambers is not purely a matter of individual choice. It is the product of structural incentives that make the choice of withdrawal rational at the individual level, even when it is harmful at the collective level. There is one more thing to explore before returning to the chambers themselves and to the specific texture of what their persistence in the Scottish landscape means. This is the question of what the investigation of Scotland's anomalous underground chambers might reveal that would be genuinely significant, as distinct from merely interesting. The scenarios range from the mundane to the transformative. In the most conservative scenario, systematic investigation of the anomalous chamber record would confirm that most of the anomalous features are in fact variants of known types, Iron Age, or later, souterrains and storage features, whose unusual characteristics are the result of regional variation, poor original documentation, or misidentification of natural features as constructed ones. This would be a legitimate and useful finding. It would resolve the uncertainty in a specific direction and allow the resources currently being wasted on an unresolved question to be redirected. In a middle scenario, investigation would confirm a subset of the anomalous features as genuinely unusual, dating to periods, or exhibiting characteristics that require expansion of the known souterrain and underground chamber typology for Scotland, and would contribute to a more nuanced understanding of the range of underground construction practice in Scottish prehistory. This, too, would be a significant contribution. In a more transformative scenario, systematic investigation would reveal that some portion of the anomalous chambers date to periods and exhibit characteristics that require substantive revision of the current understanding of prehistoric organisational complexity in Scotland, or that reveal cultural connections across geographically separated communities that the existing framework does not account for, or that establish a tradition of underground construction extending significantly further back than currently recognised. This would be a major finding, not because it requires extraordinary causes, but because it would require revision of the framework in ways that have implications beyond Scotland for the understanding of Atlantic prehistory broadly. This scenario is not the most probable outcome, but it is not impossible, and it is not the scenario that frames the question. The question is worth investigating regardless of which scenario the evidence supports, because all three outcomes contribute genuine knowledge. The chamber in the ground is not waiting for a specific outcome. It does not have preferences about which scenario the investigation confirms. It is simply there, in the state it is in, containing the evidence it contains, patient in the way that stone is patient. The urgency is on the human side, among the people who care about knowing what was built and why and by whom, who understand that every year the investigation is delayed is a year of continued uncertainty and potential loss, and who find in the question of Scotland's underground chambers something that feels worth the effort of serious inquiry. The worth is not contingent on the answer being dramatic. The practice of taking evidence seriously, of investigating questions that are genuinely open rather than assuming the answers before looking, of documenting what is found honestly rather than selectively, is worth the effort, regardless of what it finds. That practice is what separates knowledge from assumption, and knowledge, even uncertain knowledge, is what changes the map. Scotland's underground chambers are an invitation to that practice. They are evidence that something happened, that people were organised and capable and intentional, that the ground remembers things the surface has forgotten. What exactly happened? Who exactly was responsible? What exactly it meant? Those are the open questions. They will remain open until the investigation is done. The investigation is possible. The ground is patient. The question is whether we are. The geology that underlies Scotland's highland and island zones deserves a more extended treatment than it usually receives in popular accounts of the country's prehistory, because it is not simply background scenery. It is the medium through which prehistory is expressed and preserved, and its specific characteristics have determined what survives, what is found, and what is lost in ways that any serious investigation has to work with rather than around. The Lewisian gneiss basement, exposed across much of the Outer Hebrides and parts of the northwest Highland coast, is the oldest rock in the British Isles and among the oldest exposed at the Earth's surface anywhere. Its antiquity is a geological curiosity, but its relevance to the underground chamber question is more practical. Gneiss is metamorphic rock of extreme hardness and very low porosity, and structures built into or against it are in a fundamentally different preservation environment than structures in sedimentary rock or in unconsolidated deposits. The gneiss does not dissolve, does not shift under differential loading in the way that softer rocks do, and does not allow the groundwater circulation that creates the chemical environments most destructive to organic and inorganic archaeological material. A chamber constructed against a gneiss face is, all other conditions being equal, in the best possible preservation environment that Scotland's geology offers. The Torridonian sandstone, which overlies the Lewisian gneiss in much of northwest Scotland and is itself extremely ancient at approximately 1 billion years, presents a different set of conditions. Sandstone is more porous than gneiss, allows more groundwater movement, and weathers in a way that gneiss does not. But Torridonian sandstone is hard and well cemented by geological standards and the specific conditions of the Scottish Highlands, where the low temperature limits biological degradation. and the prevailing hydrology creates relatively stable groundwater conditions in many areas, mean that Torridonian sandstone preserves archaeological features reasonably well at depth. The rock-cut features documented in Northwest Highland contexts are in Torridonian sandstone in several instances, and the preservation observed in these features, where examination has been possible, is consistent with the geological expectations. The Old Red Sandstone, which dominates the geology of Caithness, Orkney, Shetland, and large parts of the Eastern Highlands, is in a different preservation class. Old Red Sandstone is a Devonian formation, approximately 370 to 400 million years old, composed of river and lake sediments deposited in an ancient basin. It weathers relatively quickly by geological standards and allows significant groundwater movement. Features in Old Red Sandstone require active hydrology management to remain in good condition over archaeological timescales. The drainage features noted in some underground chamber accounts, the channels, the slope of floors, the positioning of entry passages relative to local groundwater flow, may reflect an awareness of this requirement and a design response to it. Communities building in Old Red Sandstone contexts would have understood from experience that water management was essential to the long-term integrity of any underground construction, and the features that manage water in the documented chambers may be as informative about the builder's engineering knowledge as the construction technique itself. The Carboniferous limestone areas of Scotland, concentrated in the Midland Valley and the southern borders, create a very different underground environment from any of the above. Limestone, as noted earlier, is the substrate for natural cave formation, and the karst topography of limestone areas produces a natural underground landscape of passages, chambers, and voids that are not anthropogenic. In these areas, the distinction between natural and constructed underground features is a first-order interpretive challenge. Features that appear in drainage reports from the Midland Valley limestone areas could be natural caves, modified natural caves, or constructed chambers in the karst substrate. Each category has different significance for the archaeological question. The natural caves of the Scottish limestone are documented to varying degrees, and in some cases their archaeological content has been studied, though rarely with the systematic approach that the evidence warrants. The modified natural caves, where a natural void has been shaped and fitted with constructed elements to make it usable for human purposes, are particularly interesting because they represent a different approach to underground space than the wholly constructed chambers, one that is opportunistic and adaptive rather than planned from inception. Whether these modified natural spaces constitute a separate tradition from the wholly constructed chambers, or whether they represent the same tradition adapted to a different geological context, is a question that has not been addressed. The Midland Valley of Scotland, the lowland zone between the Highland Boundary Fault and the Southern Upland Fault, is the most densely populated part of Scotland historically and in the present. It is also the most extensively developed, modified, and built over. The archaeological landscape of the Midland Valley is buried under urban development, post-medieval agricultural improvement, and industrial infrastructure, to an extent that has made systematic prehistoric investigation extremely difficult. The underground chamber record from the Midland Valley is consequently thinner than from the more rural areas, not because the Midland Valley was less intensively used in prehistory, but because the subsequent development has been more obliterating. Development-led archaeology in the Midland Valley, in the context of urban infrastructure and building projects, has revealed prehistoric material of various kinds and periods. But underground chamber discoveries in the development context tend to be rapid, poorly understood, and frequently destructive because the development schedule does not allow extended investigation. Glasgow's underground is a specific dimension of this. The city sits on river gravels, overlying coal measures and limestone, and its development history has involved substantial underground construction. Sewers, utilities, the subway system opened in 1896, and subsequent infrastructure projects. During these construction programs, discoveries of prehistoric material have been made at various times and with varying degrees of documentation. The most interesting cases, from the perspective of the anomalous underground chamber question, are the ones where what was found did not fit the expected background of post-medieval or industrial material. These are rarely published in accessible form, partly because the development archaeology that uncovered them was focused on assessment and clearance rather than on research, and partly because the urban archaeology institutional context in Scotland has had limited capacity to engage with material that requires extended investigation. The Glasgow Underground record from the development period is a largely unexplored archive that contains, in principle, information about the prehistoric underground landscape of the central Clyde Valley that has not been compiled. Edinburgh presents a different underground character. The city is built on volcanic geology, specifically the plug and sills of an extinct volcanic system whose hard basalt and phonolite provided the foundations for the old town's dramatic ridge and the Castle Rock. The famous Edinburgh underground city of the 18th century, the network of closes, arches, and rooms beneath the Royal Mile that were buried under subsequent development and that have been partially excavated and made accessible to visitors, is not prehistoric in date. It belongs to the post-medieval period and is not relevant to the prehistoric chamber question. But the volcanic geology under Edinburgh does create underground conditions different from the surrounding sedimentary landscape, and the possibility of older underground features in this geological context, distinct from the well-known post-medieval material, has not been systematically assessed. Stirling, which sits at the meeting point of Highland and Lowland geology and whose Castle Rock is of the same volcanic origin as Edinburgh's, has an underground history that is even less well documented than Edinburgh's. The strategic importance of Stirling across recorded Scottish history has meant that the area has been intensively used and modified, and the documentation of underground features has been incidental to the broader construction and modification history. What is known suggests that the volcanic geology under the Castle Rock has been exploited for underground space at various periods, but the relationship between the historically documented use and any earlier features in the same spaces is not established. The Highland Glens present a completely different investigation context from the urban and agricultural lowland areas. The long valleys carved by glacial action, with their U-shaped profiles and steep flanking sides in crystalline or metamorphic rock, create natural settings where underground spaces in the valley walls are accessible and where the same glacial processes that carved the valley also created conditions favorable for certain kinds of underground feature formation and preservation. Rock shelters in the flanking walls of Highland Glens have been documented at multiple sites, and some have been archaeologically investigated. Constructed underground features in the same contexts have been documented less systematically, partly because fieldwork in Highland Glens requires specific logistical support, and partly because the conventional research agenda has not prioritized them. The Glen Lyon case is illustrative. Glen Lyon, one of the longest glens in Scotland, running from Loch Lyon in the west to Fortingall in the east in Perthshire, is a landscape of extraordinary archaeological richness whose surface monuments, including standing stones, cairns, and dun sites, are documented in the Canmore database. The underground archaeology of Glen Lyon is much less well documented. The geological conditions in the glen, primarily Dalradian metamorphic rocks of Precambrian age, create preservation conditions similar to the gneiss basement in the northwest, and underground features in this substrate, if they exist, would be in good preservation conditions. The local traditions of Glen Lyon preserve extensive references to the supernatural landscape of the glen, including underground spaces associated with specific figures from Gaelic mythology and legend. These references are typically treated as folklore rather than as landscape description, but the pattern of specific geographic anchoring that characterizes reliable oral tradition in other documented cases is present in the Glen Lyon material to a degree that makes a closer look worthwhile. The broader pattern of Highland Glen oral traditions and their relationship to underground features is a subject that deserves its own sustained study. The Gaelic landscape tradition of the Scottish Highlands encodes a dense web of associations between specific topographic features and narratives of various kinds. Mythological, the practical landscape knowledge embedded in these narratives is often demonstrably accurate in physical terms, and the mythological overlays often correlate with features that have archaeological significance. The underground spaces that appear in Highland oral tradition, the caves of specific figures, the passages between specific locations, the chambers of the ancestors, deserve to be mapped against the physical geography and the archaeological record in the same way that Australian Aboriginal traditions have been mapped against geological evidence. This has not been done systematically. It requires collaboration between Gaelic scholars and archaeologists, between tradition bearers and scientific researchers, in a combination that has been achieved at a few specific sites, but not as a general research program. The treatment of Gaelic language sources in Scottish archaeology is a persistent gap. Gaelic language documents, including the 17th and 18th century manuscript tradition and the earlier bardic material, contain references to the physical landscape that have not been fully mined for archaeological relevance. The manuscript tradition, in particular, which preserves material that was originally oral in forms ranging from simple toponym lists to extended narrative, contains landscape descriptions that could be geographically anchored and tested against the physical record. This work requires Gaelic linguistic competence, which is increasingly rare among archaeologists, and archaeological knowledge, which is equally rare among Gaelic scholars. The combination of the two is rare enough to constitute a genuine bottleneck in the investigation of this material. Training programs that address this bottleneck would have long-term value for multiple aspects of Scottish archaeology beyond the underground chamber question. The education dimension is broader than specialist training. The public understanding of Scottish prehistory is shaped significantly by what is taught in schools, and the school curriculum in Scotland has given increasing attention to Scottish history as distinct from British history in the post-devolution period. What Scottish prehistory looks like in the school curriculum is a question with practical consequences for whether future generations of researchers and public participants bring the knowledge and interest necessary to support the investigation of questions like the underground chamber record. A curriculum that presents Scottish prehistory as essentially settled, with known monument types in known periods and a clear narrative of cultural succession, does not prepare students for the genuine open questions. A curriculum that presents the open questions honestly, that includes the anomalous evidence alongside the settled evidence and makes clear the distinction between them, would produce a different kind of public. The anomalous underground chamber record is not likely to be in any school curriculum in the near future, but the habit of treating evidence honestly, of acknowledging uncertainty without abandoning the framework, is something that can be taught at every level. There is a specific moment in the discovery accounts that appears consistently enough to be worth naming as a pattern. It is the moment when the person making the discovery, whether a farm worker, a contractor, a surveyor, or a researcher, stands at the threshold of the underground space and decides how far to go. The records describe this moment in different ways, but they share a quality of hesitation. Not fear exactly, though in some accounts that is part of it. More a sense of being at a boundary where the normal rules of the surface world do not clearly apply, where the decision to proceed requires a kind of commitment that the person was not necessarily prepared to make. In most accounts, the person proceeds a short way, notes what they can see or infer from the portion accessible to them, and then turns back. The turning back is partly practical. The lamp runs low, the passage narrows beyond what is comfortable. There is no one else present to help in case of difficulty. But the accounts suggest it is also partly something less practical. The space is different from what is above it, and the difference is not simply physical. The still air, noted in multiple accounts, is the most commonly recurring specific observation, not the absence of a draft, exactly, which is a negative description, more the presence of a specific quality of stillness that the reporters found notable enough to mention. In some accounts, this is described as oppressive or heavy. In others, it is described as peaceful or complete. The range of emotional responses to the same physical characteristic, still air in an underground stone chamber, suggests that what the reporters were responding to was not only the physical condition but the meaning they attributed to it. Still, air in an underground chamber is the sign of a sealed space, a space whose connection to the surface atmosphere is sufficiently limited that the convective circulation that moves air above ground does not reach it. It is a sign of isolation, of separation, of a duration that is different from the duration of things above. The reporters felt this, and they described it in terms that ranged from scientific observation to personal response, and the scientific and personal were often the same thing in the same sentence. The quality of the light in these spaces, when an artificial light was introduced, is also consistently noted. Light in an underground stone chamber behaves differently from light above ground. It does not have distance in the same way, because there is no aerial perspective, no scatter of atmospheric particles to create gradations of blue and grey with distance. The far end of a chamber lit by a lamp is exactly as dark as the ceiling, and the boundary between the lit space and the dark space beyond is sharp in a way that daylight interiors are not. This optical difference is what the reporters describe when they say that the lamp did not illuminate beyond a certain point, or that the passage extended further than the light reached. They are describing an optical reality that is also a limit of knowledge. You can see to hear and know further. What is beyond is real but inaccessible to sight without more light. The metaphor of this, the way in which the limit of vision in the underground chamber represents the limit of knowledge about the chamber's extent and content, is one that the reporters do not generally make explicit, but that is present in the way they write. The chamber teaches you the shape of your own ignorance. This quality of the underground encounter, the stillness, the specific behavior of light, the sense of a boundary crossed and of further boundaries beyond reach, is not irrelevant to the question of the chamber's original purpose. If these qualities were present when the chambers were built and used, and they would have been, because they are physical properties of the space rather than products of its later history, then the people who built and used the chambers experienced them as part of what the space was. The stillness was part of what the chamber meant. The behavior of light, or more precisely of firelight, in a corbelled stone chamber with specific reflective properties was part of the designed experience of the space. The builders chose the construction technique, the dimensions, the stone, the orientation, and the entry configuration. They chose them for reasons. Among those reasons, the quality of the experience inside the finished chamber was surely one. Underground chambers are designed spaces. What was designed was not only the functional but the experiential. The experience of being inside the chamber was part of its purpose. This is not a fringe observation. It is the consistent finding of the growing body of cognitive archaeology and archaeoacoustics that has investigated prehistoric chamber spaces in Britain and Ireland. Research on the acoustic properties of megalithic chamber tombs, specifically on the way in which sound behaves in corbelled stone chambers of the Neolithic type, has found that these spaces have acoustic properties that are distinctive and that were likely significant to their users. Drumming in a corbelled stone chamber produces resonance effects quite unlike drumming above ground or in a simple earthen structure. The specific frequencies at which these effects are strongest vary with the chamber dimensions and material, and the variation is systematic. Different chambers resonate differently, and the resonance pattern of a specific chamber is a property of that chamber's design. Whether the design was deliberate in the acoustic sense, whether the builders were consciously optimizing for acoustic properties, is a question that has been addressed in the research literature with appropriate caution. The conclusion is that the acoustic properties of the chambers are unlikely to be entirely accidental, given the degree to which the dimensions and materials that produce the distinctive resonance are consistent across chambers built in similar traditions. But the degree to which acoustic design was explicit or intuitive in the builder's practice cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. If the anomalous underground chambers of Scotland share acoustic properties with the better studied chambered cairns, that would be significant evidence of a shared design tradition, because the acoustic properties are consequences of specific architectural choices that link the tradition of construction. Testing acoustic properties in accessible underground chambers is relatively inexpensive and non-destructive, requiring only a portable recording setup and the physical access to the space. This kind of investigation has been applied at chambered cairns, but not systematically at the anomalous underground chambers. It is another example of an investigation that is feasible and low cost relative to its potential informational value, but that has not been prioritized. The color of the stone in underground chambers, which some accounts note, is relevant in a way that is rarely discussed. Many Scottish prehistoric monuments make use of stone whose color was apparently chosen deliberately. The Neolithic monuments of Orkney make use of the local old red sandstone, which weathers to warm orange and buff tones that stand out against the grey-green landscape. Some chambered cairns use stone that is distinctively darker or lighter than the surrounding geology, a selection that would have been visible and meaningful. In underground contexts, where stone color is experienced in artificial light rather than in daylight, the relationship between stone color and perceived experience is different. Firelight on pale stone creates a warmth, that firelight on dark stone does not. The selection of stone for underground chambers, where it involved non-local material, as noted in some accounts, may have included aesthetic and experiential criteria alongside the practical ones. The stone selected was not simply structurally adequate, it was selected for what it would feel like to be inside a chamber built from it. This interpretation is speculative, but it is consistent with what is known about the general sophistication of prehistoric architectural design in Scotland and Ireland. The relationship between underground chambers and astronomical observation is a topic that the popular literature raises frequently, and the academic literature approaches with caution, and the distinction between the two treatments is worth unpacking. The astronomical alignment of surface prehistoric monuments is well documented and well studied. Mayshow's winter solstice alignment is the most famous Scottish example, but it is far from unique. Many chambered cairns across Britain and Ireland show alignment to solar events, particularly at the equinoxes and solstices, and the research on these alignments has produced a substantial body of evidence that the relationship is real and intentional rather than coincidental. The question for underground chambers is whether the same design intentions that produced astronomical alignments in surface structures also applied to underground construction. This is harder to assess because the entry orientation of an underground chamber relative to solar events produces different and more subtle effects than the orientation of a surface monument's passage and chamber relative to the solar, rising, or setting sun. Underground, the sun's light cannot enter directly except through a vertical shaft, which has not been noted in the anomalous chamber accounts, or through a carefully oriented entry passage that tracks the sun's position at a specific time of year. Some of the entry orientations noted in the historical accounts are consistent with solar alignment effects, but the documentation is not precise enough to make a definitive case. The question of why underground, fundamentally, is the question that all of this circles around. Why build underground rather than above ground? Why invest the extraordinary effort required to create enclosed space below the surface when enclosed space above the surface is achievable with less effort? The practical answers, temperature stability, humidity control, defensive concealment, are real but insufficient for the full range of features. The experiential answers, the specific qualities of underground space described in the encounter accounts, are real but require circular reasoning. You cannot explain the choice to build underground by the experience of being underground unless you attribute to the builders a foreknowledge of that experience that requires previous underground experience to have developed. The answer is probably that the choice to build underground developed incrementally, beginning with the use and modification of natural underground spaces, deepening through experience of what those spaces offered and what they felt like, and eventually producing a tradition of constructed underground architecture that expressed accumulated knowledge about what underground space was for and what it was like to be inside it. This developmental account, natural space use, leading to modified natural space, leading to fully constructed space, is consistent with the archaeological record in general terms. The use of natural caves in Scotland is documented back to the Paleolithic in southern England and to the early post-glacial in Scotland. The modification of natural spaces, the smoothing of walls, the creation of entry features, the installation of structural elements, appears in the record as a practice that developed in parallel with the use of natural spaces and gradually became more extensive until the modification so dominated the natural feature that the resulting space was essentially constructed. The step from extensively modified natural space to fully constructed space is not a dramatic architectural rupture. It is a practical continuation of the same impulse and the same developing knowledge. The fully constructed underground chambers, the ones that represent the highest investment and the most sophisticated design, are the end point of this development rather than its beginning. If you start from this developmental account, the anomalous chambers are not mysterious in the sense of being inexplicable. They are the mature expression of a tradition whose earlier stages are less well documented but whose trajectory is coherent. The mystery is in the gaps of the documentation rather than in the tradition itself, which is, again, an argument for investigation rather than for any particular exotic explanation. The tradition was human, was practical, was incremental, and produced results whose sophistication reflects accumulated knowledge developed over long periods. That tradition is not currently understood. It could be. The final word in any treatment of underground chambers in Scotland belongs not to the researchers or the institutions, but to the ground itself, in the sense that the ground is the location of the evidence, and the evidence is what the argument should be about. Theories about what the chambers were for, who built them, what tradition they belong to, how old they are, all of these are secondary to the physical evidence, and the physical evidence is in the ground. Going to the ground, looking at what is there, measuring and sampling and dating and documenting, is the only way to convert the theories into knowledge. The theories are necessary as motivation and as framework, but they are not the same as knowledge. Knowledge comes from the ground. The ground has been waiting a very long time. It does not appear to be in a hurry. But the people who want to know are in the position of acting before more is lost. That is the present situation. It is not a crisis. It is a choice about what to do with the opportunity that exists right now to advance understanding of something genuinely unknown about the human past in Scotland. Go slowly with the questions. They deserve the time. The chambers were built by people who knew that what they were making would last, and they were right. Long after the people were gone, the chambers remained. Long after the communities that knew about them had been disrupted and scattered, the chambers remained. Long after the agricultural improvements had covered them, and the drainage pipes had cut through some of them, and the development had destroyed others, the ones that are still there remained. There is something stubborn in a stone chamber. There is something that refuses to go away simply because the surface has forgotten. That stubbornness is an invitation. It has been an invitation for as long as people have been breaking through into these spaces and standing in the still air with their lamps, feeling the weight of what is overhead and the weight of what is not yet known. The invitation is still open. The ground beneath Scotland is old. What it holds is older than the questions being asked about it. But the questions are getting more precise. The tools for answering them are getting better, and the case for taking them seriously is getting stronger with each new piece of evidence, each archival document compiled, each oral tradition recorded, each geophysical survey that returns an anomaly where no feature was expected. The story of Scotland's underground chambers is not finished. It is barely started, in the sense that the investigation that would tell it properly has not yet been done. What we have is the outline, the suggestion, the shadow of something significant in the rock and the peat and the cold air below the surface. Enough to know the question is real, not yet enough to know the answer. That is where things stand. That is why the question matters. And that is why, if you are still here, somewhere in your night or your evening or your early morning, with the world quiet around you and the weight of the day receding, this is worth carrying into your sleep, not as an anxiety, as a curiosity. The ground holds things. We do not fully know what they are. One day, with the right effort and the right intentions and the right combination of technical skill and community partnership and institutional courage, we will know more. Until then, the chambers wait. And the question waits with them. The nature of discovery in archaeology, specifically the phenomenology of finding something underground that was not expected, is worth staying with for a moment, because the accounts in the historical record that describe these discovery moments have a quality that is not simply reportorial. The discovery moment in an underground context has specific characteristics that distinguish it from surface discovery. When a field survey reveals a previously unknown standing stone, the discovery happens in the open air, in the ordinary light of the landscape, in conditions that are continuous with the world the discoverer moved through before the stone was found. The stone is surprising, but the conditions of its discovery are not. Underground discovery is different. The transition from the surface world to the underground space is abrupt. The light changes. The air changes. The sound changes. The sense of connection to the surrounding landscape disappears. What is found in conditions that are already extraordinary, in a space that is already separated from the normal sensory world. The thing found and the conditions of its finding are both unusual, and the unusualness compounds. The reports in the historical record often have this quality of compound unusualness, where the reporters are describing not only the feature they found but the experience of finding it, and the two are inseparable in the account. The factor in his 1887 report, who described the corbelling and the still air as equal facts, the geologist who noted the chamber's dimensions and the patina on the stone and the quality of the silence in the same letter, the engineer who measured the chamber, he opened in 1869, and then described the quality of the dressed surfaces as if they had required a different order of attention than the measurements. These people were documenting their encounters with underground spaces in the full sense, including the experiential dimension that formal archaeological reporting has since trained out of the literature. The training out of personal response from archaeological reporting is defensible as a methodological choice. It produces more reproducible and less ambiguous records. But something is also lost, because the experience of the space is part of the evidence about the space, specifically evidence about what kind of experience the space was designed to produce. The literature of cave exploration, speleology, has grappled with this issue more directly than archaeology has, partly because the cave explorer is by definition someone whose encounter with underground space is central to their practice rather than incidental to it, and partly because the tradition of cave exploration writing has always included the experiential alongside the technical. Cave explorers write about what it feels like to be underground, about the specific qualities of underground perception, about the way in which the absence of natural light and the modification of the usual sensory hierarchy changes the experience of space. This literature has not been widely drawn on in the archaeological analysis of constructed underground chambers, partly because the caves of speleology are natural rather than constructed, and partly because the academic culture of archaeology is suspicious of subjective accounts as data. But the crossover between the speleological experience and the constructed underground chamber experience is close enough to be worth engaging with, because the physical conditions that produce the speleological response are the same physical conditions that the builders of constructed underground chambers were working with. Scotland has its own speleological tradition, concentrated in the limestone areas of the Midland Valley and the borders where natural cave systems exist. Scottish speleology has a history going back to the 19th century, and the records of early cave exploration in Scotland occasionally overlap with the underground chamber discovery record when explorers encountered features in cave systems that suggested human modification. These accounts are in the speleological literature rather than the archaeological literature and have not been systematically brought into the archaeological discussion. A review of the Scottish speleological literature for references to what might be constructed features would be another productive archive investigation for any serious research program on the underground chamber question. The comparative material from other parts of the world where underground constructed chambers have been studied is substantial and instructive. The hypogea of Malta, subterranean chambered structures carved into the limestone of the Maltese Islands and dating to the Neolithic period, are the most dramatic example of large-scale underground architectural construction in the Mediterranean prehistoric context. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum, the most extensively investigated of the Maltese examples, is a multi-story structure carved into the rock over several hundred years of construction and use, with architectural features of extraordinary sophistication including corbelled chambers, recessed niches, and acoustic properties that have been studied in detail. The Maltese hypogea demonstrate that large-scale underground architectural construction was achievable in the Mediterranean Neolithic, and that the organizational and technical capacity required was within the range of Neolithic communities. The Scottish anomalous chambers, even in their most ambitious documented form, are considerably less elaborate than the Hal Saflieni hypogeum. But the comparison is useful because it establishes an upper bound for what Neolithic underground construction could achieve, and because it provides a typological reference for features, corbelling technique, entry configuration, acoustic design, that appear in less complete form in the Scottish record. The underground constructions of Anatolia and the Levant, in the Bronze Age and earlier, include a range of cut-rock chambers, storage pits, cisterns, and tunnel systems that are documented in the excavation literature, and that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of underground construction in the context of dry climate management. The Scottish context is not analogous to the Anatolian in climate terms, but the construction knowledge itself, the understanding of how to cut and line rock chambers, how to manage water ingress, how to stabilize ceiling structures in cut rock contexts, is knowledge that is potentially transferable across cultural contact networks. The extent of Bronze Age cultural contact across Europe and the Mediterranean is now much better understood than it was a generation ago, thanks to ancient DNA research and isotope analysis of human remains and artifact materials. The networks of contact that moved objects, ideas, and people across Bronze Age Europe were more extensive and more regular than the model of isolated regional cultures implied. The transfer of underground construction knowledge through these contact networks is a hypothesis that is consistent with what is known about Bronze Age cultural exchange, even if the specific evidence for such transfer in the Scottish case is not currently available. Subterranean architecture in pre-Columbian North America is a further comparative case that is rarely connected to the Scottish discussion, but that offers relevant precedent. The kiva structures of the American Southwest, semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers associated with ancestral Puebloan cultures, are documented over a period of several thousand years and demonstrate a sustained tradition of underground architectural construction with ceremonial and communal functions. The kiva tradition shows that underground constructed chambers can serve as primary communal and ceremonial spaces in cultures whose surface architecture is also sophisticated, that underground and above-ground construction traditions can develop in parallel and in relationship rather than as alternatives, and that the function of underground chambers can be primarily experiential and social rather than purely practical. The kiva comparison is not an argument for a connection between the American Southwest and prehistoric Scotland. It is an argument that the cultural contexts in which underground constructed chambers have been built and used across the world show consistent patterns that reflect consistent human responses to the specific qualities of underground space, and that the Scottish evidence, whatever it ultimately proves to be, is part of a global pattern of human underground construction that crosses cultural and chronological boundaries. The underground chambers of the Cappadocian region of Turkey, the extraordinary rock-cut underground cities of Derinkuyu and Kaymakla, are another reference point that is sometimes invoked in popular treatments of the Scottish underground question, and that needs to be handled carefully. The Cappadocian underground cities are documented, spectacular, and represent a scale of underground construction that dwarfs anything proposed for Scotland. They were built in a volcanic, tough substrate that is uniquely easy to excavate, creating conditions for underground construction that do not exist in Scotland's hard rock geology. They date primarily to the Byzantine period, and later, though there is some evidence of earlier use. They are not ancient in the sense that the word is sometimes applied to them in popular accounts. The comparison between Cappadocia and Scotland is not a comparison of equivalent phenomena, but the Cappadocian cities do demonstrate one thing that is relevant: that large-scale underground construction in hard substrate, even if not in rock as hard as Scottish gneiss, was achieved by organized human communities without mechanized tools, and that the scale of what can be achieved underground without modern technology is considerably larger than intuitive assumption suggests. If communities in Byzantine Cappadocia could construct multi-story underground cities housing thousands of people, the organizational and technical ceiling for pre-industrial underground construction is not where the conservative estimate would place it. The physical experience of working in stone underground, the specific knowledge required to cut, dress, move, and set stone in a confined subterranean environment, is knowledge that has largely been lost from the living practice of cultures in the industrialized world. Traditional stone masonry, which is maintained as a craft in specific contexts, includes some of the relevant skills, but the specialized knowledge of underground cutting and fitting, working by lamplight in restricted spaces, managing stone falls, maintaining structural integrity during construction, this knowledge was developed and maintained by the communities who built underground, and it was not simple. It required apprenticeship, extended practice, and the development of intuitions about rock behavior that only come from sustained experience. The communities who built Scotland's underground chambers, whoever they were and whenever they lived, possessed this knowledge and passed it on through generations of practice. The loss of that knowledge is part of what makes the chambers enigmatic from the outside. They represent the application of knowledge that is no longer extant in the form in which it was applied. Experimental archaeology, the practice of testing archaeological hypotheses through practical reconstruction, has been applied to many aspects of Scottish prehistoric construction. The reconstruction of roundhouses, the production of Neolithic pottery, the experimental working of flint and other lithic materials. These projects have contributed substantially to the understanding of prehistoric technical knowledge and the labor required to exercise it. The experimental reconstruction of underground chamber construction in Scottish bedrock has not been attempted at any significant scale. It would be difficult, expensive, and would require a purpose-built site to be useful as a research project rather than a demonstration. But a scaled experimental project, focusing on specific technical questions like the rate of progress achievable in specific rock types with specific tool assemblages, the structural behavior of corbelled stone ceilings at given spans, the water management properties of specific drainage configurations, could produce data that is directly relevant to the interpretation of the actual chamber evidence. The question of how long it took to build a given chamber and what that implies about the labour organised to build it is answerable through experimental reconstruction in a way that it is not answerable from the chamber alone. There is a dimension of this investigation that is ultimately historical rather than archaeological, and that requires the skills of historians as much as those of archaeologists. The hill above the field above the peat.